The ship was already awake before the city was. That is how it worked in Tyre. The harbor moved on its own schedule, indifferent to sleep, indifferent to comfort. By the time the first pale light touched the eastern hills, the dock was already loud with the sound of rope under tension, of wet wood shifting against stone, of men calling to each other in short, clipped phrases that meant nothing to outsiders and everything to the people who lived by the water. If you were standing at the edge of the quay that morning, and someone was, there was always someone, you would have seen the vessel for what it was before you understood what it carried. A Phoenician merchant ship, round-hulled, deep in the water, built for capacity rather than speed. About 14 meters from bow to stern. The sail was down, the mast bare against a sky that had not yet decided what color it wanted to be. She sat low, and that told you something. She was already loaded. Before we go further, if this kind of history pulls you in, the kind that puts you inside the world rather than above it, consider subscribing to the Quiet Archive. Leave a comment telling us where you are listening from right now and what story you want to hear next. Every suggestion gets read. And if this feels like something worth sharing, a like goes a long way. Now, back to the harbor. The name of the port was Tyre. The year is harder to fix precisely, but we are somewhere in the 9th or 8th century before the Common Era, in the eastern Mediterranean, at a moment when Phoenician trade networks stretched from the Levantine coast all the way to the far edges of the known world. Tyre was not just a city. It was an engine. It processed raw ambition and turned it into cargo. The ship had a name, though names for vessels at this period were often practical rather than poetic. They referred to the god under whose protection the voyage was made, or to the merchant who owned the hull, or sometimes simply to the route. This one's name does not survive. What survives is the type, the purpose, and enough archaeological and textual evidence to reconstruct, with uncomfortable precision, what life aboard her actually looked like. And uncomfortable is the right word. There was a younger man near the stern that morning, doing something with a length of rope that he had clearly been shown how to do and had not quite mastered. He kept at it without complaint. No one was watching him, which meant either that the task was unimportant or that everyone around him had already decided he was capable of figuring it out on his own. Both possibilities said something about how this crew operated. The harbor itself was a feat of engineering that often gets overlooked in favor of the more dramatic aspects of Phoenician history. Tyre sat on a small island just off the coast, or what was then an island, later connected to the mainland by Alexander's famous causeway, centuries after the events we are describing. The city had two harbors, one facing north, one facing south. Depending on the wind, one of them was always usable. That was not an accident. Tyre had been built by people who understood that the sea did not negotiate. The northern harbor, where the merchant vessel sat, was protected by a breakwater. The water inside was calmer than it had any right to be, given the season. It was the kind of morning that made departure feel manageable, cool, relatively still, the smell of salt and something organic underneath it, the accumulated scent of a working port that never fully emptied and never fully cleaned itself. Cargo had been loaded over the previous 2 days. Not all at once, that would have been structurally reckless in a hull this shape, but in a sequence determined by weight, fragility, and the order in which items would need to be accessed during the voyage. The people overseeing this were not guessing. Loading a ship like this was a skill passed down through generations, refined by disaster, adjusted by experience. Get it wrong, and the vessel handled badly in heavy seas. Get it badly wrong, and the vessel did not return. There were about 20 men on board. The exact number varied by route length and cargo type. But for a voyage of this ambition, and this one was ambitious, the destination several weeks distant, you needed enough hands to work the sail in difficult conditions, maintain the hull during the journey, stand watch through the night, and still have enough people left functional if illness or injury reduced the crew before arrival. 20 was the lower end of adequate. Some of the men knew each other from previous voyages. Some were meeting for the first time that morning. The captain, and we will come back to him in more detail because his role was more complex than the title suggests, stood near the bow, looking out toward the harbor mouth. He was not looking at the water. He was looking at the sky above the water, at something in the behavior of the light on the horizon that required interpretation. He had been standing in the same position for several minutes. No one interrupted him. That silence was informative. On a ship this size, with a crew this experienced, uninterrupted silence around one person meant something specific. It did not mean respect in the ceremonial sense. It meant that the others recognized a calculation in progress and understood that the outcome of that calculation mattered to all of them equally. He was reading something. They were waiting for the result. What he was reading was the wind. Not the wind as it existed at that moment in the harbor, which was sheltered and therefore unreliable as a predictor. He was reading the movement of the upper air, the texture of the clouds forming over the hills to the northeast, the small behavioral signals that experienced Phoenician navigators had been cataloging and interpreting for generations. There was no written record of this knowledge in the way we would recognize. It lived in the minds of the people who used it, transferred through apprenticeship, confirmed through survival. He turned away from the horizon after a while and said something to a man standing a few meters behind him. The man nodded once and moved toward the stern. Whatever the captain had decided, the ship was going to act on it. Loading continued. The younger man near the stern had solved his rope problem, or had reached a point where the rope was secure enough that no one would notice it had ever been a problem. He moved on to the next task without marking the moment. There was no one to mark it for him. That was not coldness. That was the texture of life on a working vessel. Competence was expected, not applauded. What got noticed was failure, and failure had consequences that were immediate and shared by everyone aboard. The city behind the harbor was beginning to wake up now, sound by sound. A dog somewhere in the lower streets. The percussion of a market stall being assembled. A child's voice, distant and unconcerned. The harbor absorbed all of it and converted it into background, the way harbors always do. The ship existed in a slightly different register than the city behind it, technically part of the same place, but already pointing somewhere else. That was what a loaded ship did to the air around it. It reorganized the direction of attention. And the cargo below deck, purple-dyed cloth, raw glass, worked metal, cedar oil sealed in ceramic vessels, and at least one item that nobody on the dock would have been told about, that cargo was waiting with the patience of objects that do not know what is coming and do not need to. The voyage had not begun yet, but the harbor already felt like something behind them. Nobody on that ship had chosen this life the way people choose things now. There was no moment of decision, no clear before and after. For most of them, the sea had simply been there, present from childhood, woven into the economy of every family that lived within walking distance of the Tyrian harbor. You grew up near the water, you worked near the water, and eventually the water took you with it. The crew of 20 was not a uniform group. That is worth establishing early, because it is easy to imagine a Phoenician merchant vessel as crewed by Phoenicians. But that was rarely the whole picture. Tyre was a trading city, which meant it was also a city of contact, of mixture, of people who had arrived from somewhere else and stayed long enough to become useful. Among the 20 men, there were likely sailors from Cyprus, possibly 1 or 2 from the Aegean coast, and at least one man whose accent placed him somewhere further south, toward Egypt or the Sinai. What they shared was not origin. What they shared was function. The most experienced sailors were easy to identify, not by any insignia or formal marker, but by the way they moved on deck. There is a specific quality of movement that develops in people who have spent years on small vessels, a constant, barely visible adjustment, a body that has learned to anticipate the shift of the hull before it happens. On solid ground, these men often looked slightly uncomfortable, as if the stillness of the earth was something they had to consciously manage. On the ship, they looked like they were exactly where their bodies expected to be. The younger man near the stern, the one we noticed earlier with the rope, was not yet one of them. He was somewhere in his late teens, old enough to be trusted with real work, young enough that the older crew still tracked him peripherally without making it obvious. He had been on shorter coastal runs before, but nothing like this. This voyage was different in scale, in destination, in the kind of risk it carried. He knew that. You could see it in the way he moved, careful, deliberate, slightly too aware of being watched, even when no one was watching. His name is not recorded anywhere. Neither are the names of most of the men on that ship. What we have are the material traces, the hull design, the cargo manifests, the port records, the occasional inscription, and from those traces we reconstruct the outlines of people who left no direct account of themselves. That absence is itself a kind of information. It tells you something about who got to leave records and who did not. There was a man responsible for the cargo. Not the captain, a separate role, though the boundary between the two could blur, depending on who owned the ship and who owned the goods. In many Phoenician trading operations, the merchant and the navigator were distinct figures with distinct interests that did not always align. The captain needed to make decisions based on the sea and the weather and the state of the hull. The merchant needed to make decisions based on the cargo and the market and the contract waiting at the other end. When those priorities conflicted, and they would at some point on any voyage long enough, the tension had to be resolved without the benefit of a rulebook. That tension was already present on the dock that morning, visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The merchant had arrived late. Not dramatically late, not late enough to delay departure, but late in a way that the captain had noticed and filed away. He said nothing about it. The merchant said nothing about it. The subject existed between them as a small, hard object that neither man chose to pick up. Below deck, where most of the crew would sleep, the space was what it was. There were no cabins, no divisions, no private areas, beyond what a man could claim by positioning his body and his few possessions in a particular spot, and being willing to defend that claim by presence alone. The cargo occupied the center of the hull. The crew arranged themselves around it, between it, on top of it in some cases. Comfort was not part of the calculation. What each man had brought with him fit into a small bundle. Extra clothing if he had it. Something to eat during the first day before the communal provisions took over. In some cases, a small object, a figurine, a token, something that connected the man to a place or a person he was leaving behind. These objects were not discussed. They were private in the way that very few things could be private on a vessel this size. The cook, if you could call him that, was a compact man in his 40s who had the particular stillness of someone who had long ago made peace with a job that everyone depended on and nobody respected. He worked in a small designated area near the stern where fire could be managed without threatening the hull. What he produced was functional rather than varied. Grains, dried fish, oil, whatever fresh provisions had been loaded and would need to be used before they spoiled. On a voyage of several weeks, fresh food was a brief luxury at the start. Then it was about what lasted. The men who had sailed together before fell into their roles without discussion. There were no announcements, no assignments spoken aloud that morning. The work organized itself through a kind of accumulated knowledge, each person knowing what the others expected of them, what gaps needed filling, what tasks would go badly if left unaddressed. It was not harmony exactly. It was something more practical than harmony. The newer men watched and matched pace. The young man near the stern had found his rhythm by now, moving between tasks with slightly more confidence than an hour before. Something had shifted in him, small, not yet visible to the others, but present. The ship was becoming real to him in a way it had not been when he first stepped aboard. That shift mattered more than it seemed, because the voyage ahead would ask things of him that no coastal run had prepared him for. And the crew around him, experienced, practical, already looking toward the harbor mouth, would not slow down to wait for him to be ready. The tide was moving. The captain had returned to the stern. The merchant stood amidships, one hand resting on a wooden beam, eyes on the open water beyond the breakwater. Whatever calculation each man was running had reached its conclusion. The ship was about to leave Tyre, and what it was carrying, all of it, the cargo and the crew and the unspoken things between them, was about to be committed to the sea. The cargo was the reason for all of it. The ship, the crew, the tension on the dock that morning, everything traced back to what was sitting in the hull. Understanding what the Phoenicians carried is not a minor detail. It is the entire logic of why these voyages happened at all. The most valuable item on board was also the most immediately recognizable: Tyrian purple. Cloth dyed in a color so specific, so difficult to produce, and so consistently associated with wealth and authority, that it had become something close to a currency in its own right. The dye came from a small sea snail, Murex trunculus among others, harvested in enormous quantities from the waters around the Levantine coast. The process of extracting it was slow, labor-intensive, and produced a smell that ancient sources describe with a consistency that suggests it was genuinely difficult to be near. The dye workshops of Tyre were located at the edges of the city, downwind when possible. A single gram of pure Tyrian purple required thousands of snails. The cloth dyed with it did not fade the way other colors faded. It deepened with exposure to sunlight, shifting toward a richer, darker tone over time. That permanence was part of what made it valuable, and part of what made it politically significant. Across the Mediterranean world, purple cloth was worn by kings, by priests, by people whose authority needed to be visible at a distance. The Phoenicians had not invented this association, but they had industrialized it. The bolts of cloth in the hull were wrapped carefully, layered against moisture, positioned where they would not be crushed by shifting weight. The merchant knew exactly how many there were. He had counted them himself twice before the loading was complete. Alongside the cloth, there was glass. Phoenician glasswork from this period was not the transparent material we associate with the word today. It was opaque, colored, dense. Small vessels and ornaments produced through a core-forming technique that required extraordinary skill and produced objects of considerable beauty. Blue and turquoise were the most common colors, derived from copper compounds. Some pieces carried patterns wound into the surface, threads of contrasting color pulled into waves or feathers while the glass was still workable. These were not practical objects. They were prestige goods, the kind of thing that moved between elites as gifts, as markers of relationship, as proof that the person giving them had access to something rare. There was cedar oil, sealed in ceramic vessels with stoppers fixed in place, and then coated with a resin that hardened into a near-permanent seal. Cedar from the mountains of Lebanon was one of the foundational trade goods of the ancient Near East. The wood itself too large and too heavy to ship in quantity on a vessel this size, but the oil extracted from it was compact, stable, and valued across the Mediterranean for uses ranging from perfumery to wood preservation to ritual application. The smell of it was present in the hull, even through the sealed containers, a deep, resinous undertone beneath everything else. Worked metal occupied a section of the lower hull. Bronze vessels, some finished to a high polish, others left in a state that suggested they were intended to be reworked at the destination. Phoenician metalwork was sought after not just for its quality, but for the designs worked into its surface, hybrid imagery that drew from Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Aegean visual traditions simultaneously, producing something that was recognizably Phoenician, precisely because it belonged completely to none of its sources. A bronze bowl with a lotus border and a central scene of a hero subduing a lion was not Egyptian art or Mesopotamian art. It was something that had processed both and produced a third thing. And then there was the item that had not been discussed on the dock. It occupied a small section of the hull, separated from the other cargo by a physical gap that nobody had commented on and nobody had closed. It was not large. It was wrapped in a way that made its shape ambiguous. Not obviously a vessel, not obviously a piece of cloth, not obviously anything that a casual inspection would identify with certainty. The merchant had overseen its placement personally. The captain had not asked about it. That restraint was its own kind of communication. In the commercial world of the ancient Mediterranean, there were goods that moved openly and goods that moved quietly, and the people involved in moving them understood the difference without needing it explained. The captain's job was the sea. What the merchant chose to include in the manifest, and what he chose to leave out, was not the captain's concern as long as the weight was declared accurately and the hull sat at the right level in the water. It did. So the subject remained closed. The total value of the cargo, by any reasonable estimate, represented a sum that most people in the ancient Mediterranean world would not accumulate in a lifetime. It also represented a risk of equivalent scale. Ships were lost. Not rarely, frequently enough that the commercial infrastructure of Phoenician trade had developed early forms of risk-sharing arrangements, proto-insurance agreements, in which multiple investors contributed to a voyage in exchange for proportional returns, distributing the possibility of total loss across enough parties that no single disaster would be catastrophic for any one of them. The merchant on this ship was not the sole owner of what sat in the hull. There were other men, back in Tyre, whose money was currently sitting in the water. They would not know the outcome of this voyage for weeks, possibly months. Communication moved at the speed of ships, which meant it moved at the speed of wind and current, and the decisions of captains reading skies that no one else could read for them. The investors in Tyre would wait. They had done it before. That did not make the waiting easier. Below deck, the cargo sat in its arranged silence. The purple cloth, the glass, the oil, the metal, the unnamed thing in its wrappings, all of it patient, all of it indifferent to what was coming. Objects do not know they are at risk. The men above them did. And the sea, beyond the breakwater, was beginning to show the first signs of a wind that had not been there an hour ago. Departure was not a single moment. It was a sequence of small actions that accumulated until the ship was no longer part of the harbor, and the harbor was no longer part of the ship. There was no clear line between the two states. One condition simply replaced the other gradually, the way light changes, without you being able to identify the exact second it shifted. The lines were cast off in a specific order. Stern first, then bow. Then the spring lines that kept the hull from swinging against the dock while the others were released. This sequence was not discussed that morning. It was the sequence, the one everyone on the crew knew, the one that had been correct for long enough that questioning it would have required a better reason than anyone had. The men handling the lines moved without instruction. Each one knew when his moment was. Before the lines were touched, there had been a ritual. Brief, functional, conducted without ceremony in the way that genuinely believed rituals often are. The captain had made an offering at the small shrine fixed near the bow, a simple structure, little more than a niche in the wood, housing a figurine of Melkart, the Tyrian god, whose domain included the sea and the cities that depended on it. The offering was oil and grain, poured and scattered in a specific pattern that the captain had performed enough times that his hands knew the motions without his mind needing to direct them. He spoke words quietly. No one stood close enough to hear them. This was not superstition in the dismissive sense the word sometimes carries. It was an acknowledgement of accurate information. The sea could kill you. The god associated with the sea had power over that outcome, or was understood to have power, which in practical terms amounted to the same thing. The ritual was a form of communication with that power, conducted by a man who had survived enough voyages to believe the communication was worth making. Whether it worked in any measurable sense was a question that the ancient world did not separate from the question of whether it was worth doing. The merchant watched the ritual from a distance. He had his own relationship with the gods of commerce and travel, Astarte, in his case, whose protection extended across the Phoenician world in ways that overlapped with and sometimes competed with the domains of other deities. He had made his own offering the previous evening, privately, at a temple in the city. He did not repeat it now. One offering was a communication. Two would have been anxiety made visible, and he was not willing to show the crew that. The young man near the stern had no shrine and no private ritual. He had a small fired clay figurine tucked into the bundle with his spare clothing, a thing his mother had pressed into his hand the morning he left home, without explanation, in the way that objects given at departures often carry more meaning than the words accompanying them. He had not looked at it since he boarded. He knew it was there. That was enough. When the stern line came free, the hull moved. Not dramatically, a small rotation, the bow swinging slightly away from the dock as the water took the weight that the rope had been holding. To someone watching from the quay, it would have been almost imperceptible. To the men on board, it was immediate and total. The ship had changed state. It was no longer attached to anything. Oars were used to move out of the harbor. The wind inside the breakwater was unreliable, deflected and redirected by the stone walls and the other vessels moored along the quay. You could not trust it to take you where you needed to go in a space this confined. So the oars came out, long, heavy, worked by the men who had been assigned to them, pulling in a rhythm called by a single voice from the stern in short, even counts that left no room for individual interpretation. Everyone pulled together, or the oars crossed and tangled, and the hull turned the wrong direction at the wrong moment. In a crowded harbor, that kind of mistake had consequences. The other ships watched them go. Not with attention exactly. The harbor was busy enough that no single departure commanded sustained observation. But there were eyes on the water, as there always were, the passive tracking of movement that working port people developed without noticing they had developed it. A vessel leaving meant a space opening up at the dock. It meant a cargo gone from the market. It meant a crew of 20 removed from the economy of the harbor taverns and the harbor streets for however long the voyage lasted. The city receded. That is the only word for it. Not that they moved away from Tyre, but that Tyre diminished, slowly, the details of the harbor compressing into a general shape of stone and sail and smoke from the morning fires. The sound went first. The dog, the market stall, the child's voice, all of it absorbed by distance before the image faded. Sound carries differently over water than over land, and for a few minutes the men on the ship existed in a strange acoustic state. The city visually present but orally gone, reduced to the creak of the hull and the rhythm of the oars and the water moving against the bow. When they cleared the breakwater, everything changed. The wind that had been building beyond the harbor came aboard, all at once, not violently but decisively, filling the space around the hull with a presence that the sheltered water had not prepared them for. The sail went up. The oars came in. The rhythm of the vessel shifted from the human cadence of rowing to something older and less predictable, the movement of a hull being pushed by air across open water. The young man shipped his oar and found his position on deck. For a moment he stood still, which was something the more experienced crew did not do. They were already moving, adjusting lines, reading the sail's behavior in the new wind, making the 1,000 small corrections that a vessel under sail constantly required. He stood still for 3 seconds, maybe 4, then he moved. Behind them, Tyre was still visible. It would remain visible for some time yet. The island city sat high enough above the water that its outline persisted long after the detail was gone. Some of the men looked back. Some did not. The ones who did not were not indifferent. They had simply learned, over years of departures, that looking back did not change what was ahead. The merchant stood at the rail and watched the city until it became a shape, and then a line, and then a suggestion on the horizon. His expression did not change during any of this. What was happening behind it was not available for inspection. That was a skill he had developed long before he became the kind of man who put entire fortunes onto ships and sent them into open water. The coast of the Levant ran north and south on either side of their course. For now, they would follow it, hugging the familiar shore before committing to the open passages that the voyage would eventually require. That transition from coastal to open water was still days away, but it was already present in the calculations of every experienced man on board. The coast was known. What came after it was a different kind of known, familiar in outline, unpredictable in detail, and unforgiving of the difference between the two. The ship moved north. The wind held. For now, everything was as it should be. That was the thing about the sea at the beginning of a voyage. It gave you nothing to worry about yet, which was its own kind of warning. The coast was not just scenery. It was a navigation tool, a reference system, a continuous conversation between the ship and the land it ran alongside. Phoenician sailors did not navigate by ignoring the shore. They read it, the way you read a text you have memorized but still consult, because the act of consulting is itself part of how you stay accurate. Every headland had a name. Every bay had a character, the way it held wind, the way its bottom behaved in an anchor drop, whether it was safe in a northern swell or treacherous in one coming from the west. This knowledge was not written down in any form that has survived. It existed as spoken information, passed between sailors in harbors and on deck, accumulated over generations into a collective map that lived entirely in human memory. Lose enough of the people who carried it, and you lost the map. That was a vulnerability the Phoenicians understood and managed by ensuring the knowledge moved constantly between experienced sailors and the men who were still learning. The captain worked the coast with a confidence that looked like ease but was not. Ease implies the absence of effort. What he was doing required continuous attention, reading the watercolor for depth, watching the behavior of birds over particular stretches of shore, noting the smell of the air when it came off the land at certain angles, cross-referencing all of it against the accumulated knowledge of every previous time he had run this section of coast. He made it look simple because he had done it long enough that the complexity had moved below the threshold of visible effort. It had not disappeared. Watercolor was one of the primary depth indicators. Deep water ran dark, blue to near black, depending on the sky above it. As the bottom rose, the color shifted, green, then lighter green, then the pale translucent tone that meant shallow water, and the kind of decision that needed to be made quickly. A hole drawing as much water as this one required constant awareness of what was underneath. Running aground on a rocky shelf in calm weather was embarrassing and damaging. Running aground in any other conditions was potentially fatal. The young man had been assigned to the bow that morning. His job was straightforward in description and demanding in practice. Watch the water ahead, watch the color, watch for anything that did not belong. Floating debris, unexpected shallows, the dark shape of a submerged rock catching light at the wrong angle. Report anything that looked wrong. Do not report things that were not wrong, because false alarms created noise in a system that depended on signal. The instruction had been delivered in 4 words by the man who assigned him: watch and say something. He was good at it, it turned out. Better than he had expected to be. There was something in the task that matched a quality of attention he had always had, but never had a use for. A patience with sustained observation. A comfort with looking at the same thing for a long time without needing it to change. The water ahead of the bow was endlessly variable if you looked at it long enough. No 2 stretches were identical. The differences were mostly meaningless, but sorting the meaningful from the meaningless was the entire job, and he found he could do it. By midday, they had passed 3 headlands that the captain had named quietly to no one in particular as they came into view. Names in Phoenician that the men from the Aegean coast probably did not know, spoken not as announcement but as private confirmation, the captain checking his own position against his internal map. All 3 matched what he expected. The voyage was running true. The wind had settled into a pattern from the northwest, not strong, not gentle, consistent in the way that experienced sailors recognized as a gift with a limited duration. Consistent wind was never permanent. It was a condition that would change, and the change would come without announcement. The sail was trimmed to take maximum advantage of it while it lasted, and the captain had said nothing about reducing sail, which the crew read correctly as permission to run at full pace for as long as the wind held. The coast here was rocky and dramatic. High limestone cliffs dropping straight into dark water, interrupted at intervals by small coves where the rock had given way to gravel beaches. Some of those coves had fires in them at night, visible from the sea as small orange points that told you someone was there without telling you who. Fishermen usually. Sometimes, people who did not want to be seen from the coast road, and had chosen the sea-facing side of the land as a result. The ship passed them without comment. Other people's reasons for being where they were at night were not the crew's concern unless those reasons came aboard. Navigation at night along this coast required a different set of tools. The stars were primary, specific stars used as fixed reference points, their positions relative to the horizon giving both direction and, to a trained eye, a rough sense of latitude. The Phoenicians used the constellation we now call Ursa Minor with particular precision, a fact noted by Greek writers who credited the Phoenicians with introducing this navigational technique to the wider Mediterranean world. Whether that credit is entirely accurate is debatable. What is not debatable is that Phoenician navigators used the night sky with a consistency and reliability that allowed them to maintain course through darkness in ways that their contemporaries found remarkable. But stars required a clear sky. And the sky, as the afternoon developed, was becoming less clear. Not alarmingly. There was no dramatic build of cloud, no change in the wind that suggested incoming weather, just a thickening of the upper air, a softening of the light that the captain noticed and said nothing about, which was itself a form of saying something to the men who knew how to read his silences. They were still in coastal waters, still within reach of shelter if the weather decided to become a problem. That proximity to land was a form of safety, but it was also a form of risk. Rocky coasts in deteriorating weather were not refuges. They were hazards, and the margin between using the coast as a navigation aid and being driven onto it by a wind shift was a margin that required constant management. The captain was managing it. The crew could feel that in the way the ship was being handled, slightly more conservative than the wind required, holding a course that kept more distance from the cliffs than strictly necessary. The young man at the bow had noticed the sky change too. He had not said anything because he did not know if what he was seeing was significant or not, and the instruction had been specific: say something when something is wrong, not when something might be changing. He watched the water, and he watched the horizon, and he kept the distinction between observation and alarm as clean as he could. That discipline was harder than it sounded. Late in the afternoon, they came round a headland that opened into a wider bay. The captain altered course slightly, bringing the bow around to take advantage of a wind shift that the headland had been blocking. The sail responded immediately, the hull accelerating in a way that was viscerally satisfying, the kind of movement that reminded everyone on board why this work, despite everything, was also something else, something that had no clean name in any language. The bay ahead was wide and calm, and the far shore was still an hour away. Between here and there, the water was deep and consistent, and the color held steady. Nothing to report from the bow, nothing to adjust at the sail. Just the ship moving through the late afternoon light, carrying everything it carried, heading toward a destination that was still days away, and already pulling at them like a current they could not yet feel. Every ship had a structure of authority. Not the kind written into a document or announced at departure, the kind that existed in behavior, in who spoke first, in who waited before speaking, in the precise social geometry of 20 men living in a space that gave none of them room to pretend the others were not there. On a vessel this size, hierarchy was not abstract. It was physical, daily, and enforced not by punishment alone, but by something older and more reliable than punishment. Reputation. On a Phoenician trading ship, what a man had done before was the primary currency of his standing. Not what he claimed, not what he looked like, not where he came from. What he had actually done, in conditions that could be verified by other men who had been there. The Mediterranean sailing world was small enough that reputations traveled faster than most ships. A man who had handled a difficult situation well on a run between Tyre and Cyprus would be known for it 3 ports away before he arrived. A man who had failed in a way that cost lives or cargo would carry that too, whether he wanted to or not. The captain's authority rested on a foundation that the crew had assessed before they agreed to sail with him. This was not a formal process. There were no contracts specifying the right to refuse a captain, but in practice, experienced sailors chose their voyages partly by choosing who was running them. A captain with a poor record had difficulty crewing a ship. A captain with a strong record could be selective about who he took on. The market for skilled sailors was competitive enough that this dynamic had real force. This captain had a strong record. The crew knew it. That knowledge shaped every interaction on board, in ways that were mostly invisible because they functioned correctly, the way a well-built structure is invisible until it fails. When he gave an instruction, it was followed without the pause that precedes a question. When he made a decision that cost the crew comfort, a course change that meant rowing against the wind, a decision to push through the night instead of anchoring, there was no audible dissent. Not because dissent was forbidden, but because the men around him had enough experience to recognize competence when it was operating, and competence in a captain was worth more than comfort. Below the captain, the hierarchy branched in ways that were not always linear. The merchant occupied a parallel track of authority, not superior to the captain on matters of seamanship, but sovereign over decisions about the cargo, the trading stops, the timing of transactions at each port. In theory, these domains were separate. In practice, they overlapped constantly, and the management of that overlap was one of the defining challenges of every long voyage. A captain who resented the merchant's commercial authority could make the voyage miserable in small, technically defensible ways. A merchant who undermined the captain's navigational decisions in front of the crew could destabilize the authority structure the entire ship depended on. Neither man wanted that outcome. The question was always whether their restraint would hold under pressure. It had not been tested yet. They were still in coastal waters, still within the first days of the voyage, still in the phase where everything was manageable and the friction between them existed only as potential. But it was there. The men who had sailed long enough to read these things could feel it in the way the captain and the merchant occupied the deck, careful about proximity, careful about the timing of conversations, each one giving the other slightly more space than the ship's dimensions required. Below both of them were the senior sailors, 3 or 4 men whose experience placed them in an informal tier of responsibility that had no title but was universally understood. They were the ones who translated the captain's decisions into specific actions, who knew which of the younger crew could be trusted with what, who managed the 100 small frictions of communal living at sea without escalating them into the captain's domain, unless they had to. They were also the men the captain consulted when he needed a second opinion on something he was not certain about, a conversation that happened quietly, without ceremony, in a way that preserved the appearance of unilateral authority while actually distributing the cognitive load of command. One of these senior men had taken a particular interest in the young man at the bow. Not warmly. Warmth was not his operating mode, but with the specific attention of someone who had identified a potential asset and was in the process of determining its actual value. He had watched the young man handle the rope problem that morning without intervening. He had assigned him to the bow and watched how he settled into the task. He had noted, without commenting on, the moment in the afternoon when the young man had noticed the sky changing and had chosen to say nothing because he was not certain his observation was significant. That restraint had been the right call. The fact that the young man had arrived at the right call through reasoning rather than instinct was interesting information. Instinct came later, if it came at all. It was not a starting point, it was an end product. The residue of enough correct reasoning, repeated often enough, that the reasoning eventually disappeared and only the result remained. The young man was at the beginning of that process. Whether he would complete it depended on variables that no one could fully control. The voyages he survived, the decisions he was forced to make before he was ready, the quality of the attention he brought to both. The rest of the crew occupied the lower levels of the hierarchy, with varying degrees of comfort. There were men who had been sailors long enough to be skilled, but not long enough to have accumulated the kind of record that raised your standing, competent, reliable, essentially invisible in the social structure of the ship, because they did nothing that required special notice in either direction. These men were the load-bearing middle of any crew. Remove them, and the ship struggled. Celebrate them, and they looked confused, because the culture they operated in did not have a register for celebrating the adequately functional. At the lower end were the men on their early voyages, the young man among them, though not at the very bottom. Below him, in terms of experience and therefore standing, was one other crew member, a boy of perhaps 15, who had been brought aboard in a capacity that was not quite sailor and not quite servant, and occupied the undefined space between those roles with the particular invisibility of someone who has not yet been assigned a category. He moved around the ship doing whatever needed doing, which meant he was always busy and always in someone's way, and responded to both conditions with a patience that suggested he had learnt early that patience was his primary available tool. The hierarchy functioned because everyone on board understood that it was not arbitrary. It reflected real differences in knowledge and capability that had direct consequences for whether they all arrived at the destination or did not. On land, you could resent a social structure that placed you below someone you considered your equal. At sea, resentment of that kind was a luxury the situation did not support. The man above you in the hierarchy knew things you did not yet know. The gap between his knowledge and yours was not an injustice. It was a fact, and facts at sea had a way of making themselves felt regardless of how you felt about them. Night was coming on. The coast to the east had gone dark, the limestone cliffs losing their detail and becoming a solid mass against a sky that was shifting from pale orange to something deeper. The captain had chosen to continue through the night rather than anchor. The weather was holding, the coast here offered no harbour worth stopping for, and the schedule demanded progress. Watch rotations were assigned with the same economy of language that governed everything else on board. Names, positions, times. No elaboration. The young man was on the second watch. He had a few hours before he was needed. He found his place below deck, among the cargo and the sleeping men, and lay down in the dark with the movement of the hull beneath him, and the sound of the water against the planking, and the smell of cedar oil and rope, and the close human smell of a working crew. He did not sleep immediately. He lay still and listened to the ship, trying to learn its language before it had reason to speak loudly. The first night at sea was different from any night on land. Not dramatically different. There was no single quality that separated it cleanly from the experience of sleeping in a room, or on a hillside, or in a harbour warehouse. The difference was cumulative, built from small things that individually meant nothing, and together meant everything. The motion was the first thing. Not violent motion. The sea that night was cooperative, a long, low swell from the northwest that moved the hull in a slow, continuous rhythm that had no beginning and no end. For the men who had sailed before, this motion was background, something the body had already learned to absorb without registering it as sensation. For the young man lying in the dark below deck, it was still present in his awareness, not unpleasant, but insistent, a reminder that the surface he was lying on was not connected to anything fixed. The sound was the second thing. The ship at night produced a continuous layered noise that daylight somehow obscured. Wood under tension, speaking in low creaks that shifted in pitch as the hull flexed through each swell. Water against the planking, close enough that you could hear individual movements of it. Not the general sound of the sea, but the specific conversation between the hull and the particular water it was moving through at that moment. Rope under load, vibrating at a frequency that was more felt than heard. The sail above, breathing in and out with the wind in a rhythm that occasionally matched the swell and occasionally fell against it, producing an irregular counterpoint that never quite resolved. The men who were not on watch slept in the spaces between cargo and hull, bodies arranged with the pragmatic efficiency of people who had learned to extract rest from whatever configuration the available space permitted. Some slept deeply and immediately, the particular skill of sailors and soldiers who have trained themselves to take sleep when it is offered because the next opportunity is not guaranteed. Others shifted and resettled, chasing a comfort that the ship was not designed to provide. Nobody complained. Complaint about discomfort was a transaction that cost social standing and purchased nothing. Above deck, the watch moved in the darkness with the careful economy of men who knew the space well enough to navigate it without light. The stars were partially obscured by the high cloud that had been building since afternoon, not covered completely, but softened. Their light diffused into a general luminescence that was enough to see the sail and the horizon and the shape of the coast to the east, but not enough for detail. The man on watch at the bow stood with his arms loose at his sides and his weight balanced against the movement of the hull, and watched the darkness ahead with the particular quality of attention that night watch required, not searching exactly, but present, receptive, ready to process whatever the darkness offered without demanding that it offer anything specific. The coast was still visible as a darker mass against the dark sky, close enough to be a reference point, far enough to be safe in the current conditions. The captain had set a course that maintained this distance deliberately, close enough to use the land for orientation, far enough that a wind shift would not immediately create a crisis. The calculation behind that course had been made in daylight and was now being executed in darkness by men who trusted it because the man who made it had earned that trust. Trust of that kind was not passive. It was a conclusion reached through evidence, revised continuously, and withdrawn the moment the evidence no longer supported it. Somewhere around the midpoint of the night, the swell changed. Not dramatically, a slight increase in period, the waves arriving with a fractionally longer interval between them, which meant the energy driving them had traveled from further away. The man on watch felt it before he consciously identified it, a shift in the rhythm of the hull that his body registered as information before his mind had processed it into words. He stood still for a moment, feeling the new pattern, comparing it to the old one, deciding what it meant. Then he moved to the stern and said something quietly to the captain, who was not asleep. The captain was rarely fully asleep at sea. This was not insomnia. It was a state of reduced consciousness that retained a thread of awareness connected to the ship, available to be pulled taut by anything that required attention. He had developed it over years of command, and it had become so habitual that he no longer experienced it as vigilance. It was simply how he existed on a vessel in motion. On land, he slept heavily and woke confused, as if the absence of the ship's constant input left his monitoring system with nothing to do and nowhere to direct itself. He listened to what the watchman told him about the swell. He lay still for a moment and felt the hull himself, cross-referencing the watchman's description against his own body's reading of the motion. Then he got up without urgency and went to the bow and stood there for several minutes, looking at the horizon, feeling the wind on his face, checking the behavior of the stars where they were visible through the cloud. He came back and made a small adjustment to the course, a few degrees east, bringing them marginally closer to the coast. He said nothing about why. The watchman did not ask. Below deck, the young man was still awake when the course changed. He felt it in the altered angle of the hull's motion, a subtle shift in the direction of the swell relative to the keel, a change in the pattern of sounds from the water against the planking. He did not know what it meant. He knew that something had been decided above him, by someone whose judgment he had no grounds yet to question, and that the decision had been made quietly and without apparent alarm. He filed the sequence, observation, decision, adjustment, silence, as information about how things worked on this ship. Then he closed his eyes and worked on sleeping. The night passed in its sections. The watches rotated. The swell remained at its new period, but did not increase further. The cloud thickened slightly and then stabilized. The coast held its position to the east, a constant dark presence that the ship maintained its distance from without drama. In the hours before dawn, the sea had a quality that experienced sailors described in various ways, but always returned to the same essential characteristic, a kind of concentrated silence that was not the absence of sound, but something closer to the presence of a very large thing holding still. The wind dropped to almost nothing. The swell continued, driven by whatever had generated it far to the northwest, but without the wind to texture the surface. The water between the swells went flat and dark, and the hull moved through it with a smoothness that felt like permission. The young man came up on deck for his watch in this pre-dawn stillness, and stood at the bow and understood for the first time what the sea actually was, at this distance from land, in this light, at this hour. Not a route, not a surface. Something that had existed before the ship and would exist after it, that accepted the hull's passage without registering it, that contained within its dark volume a scale of indifference that made the 20 men on board, their cargo, their calculations, their carefully maintained hierarchy, feel precisely as significant as they were. He stood at the bow and watched the darkness, and did his job. The coast was there to the east. The stars were there above, partial and cold through the cloud. The ship moved beneath him with its continuous, indifferent competence. And somewhere ahead, still days away, the voyage was waiting for them to arrive at the part of it that had not yet happened. Dawn came without announcement. The sky simply became less dark in the east, by degrees, until the coast resolved out of the night, and the water showed its color again, and the sail above him shifted from a pale shape to a thing with texture and weight. The ship emerged from the night intact. All 20 men accounted for. The cargo undisturbed. The course holding. The captain came on deck and looked at the sky for a long time without speaking. What he saw there did not make him smile. It did not make him frown either. It made him stand very still, in the way he stood when he was converting what he observed into a decision that the rest of them would feel before they understood it. Hunger on a ship was a managed condition, not an accident. The people who provisioned a voyage of this length had done the calculation before a single item went aboard. How many men, how many days, what margin for delay, what allowance for the unpredictable. Get it wrong in one direction, and you arrived at the destination with rotting food and wasted space. Get it wrong in the other direction, and you arrived somewhere you had not planned to stop, trading cargo for provisions at prices set by people who knew exactly how desperate you were. The provisioning of this ship had been done by someone who had made the calculation many times before. The margin was adequate. Adequate was the best you aimed for. The morning meal was distributed not long after dawn. Flatbread baked 2 days earlier in Tyre, still edible, the texture changed, but the substance intact. Dried fish, intensely salty, the kind that required water to eat without difficulty, and provided that water requirement as a form of nutritional logic. Eat the fish, drink more water, the body receives both. Olive oil in a communal vessel passed from hand to hand. Figs, dried, dense, with concentrated sweetness, that the body recognized as useful before the mind had processed it as food. The men ate standing or sitting wherever they had space, without ceremony, with the focused efficiency of people who understood that a meal was fuel and treated it accordingly. There was conversation, low, sporadic, the kind that exists alongside eating rather than competing with it. A comment about the wind direction. Something about the course change in the night, delivered without accusation, but with the implicit question embedded in the phrasing. One of the senior sailors answered it in 4 words that closed the subject without explaining it. The man who had asked did not push. Water was the more serious calculation. Food spoiled, but could be supplemented at ports along the route. Water had no equivalent flexibility. You carried what you carried, you managed what you managed, and when it ran short, there was no substitute and no negotiation with the problem. The large ceramic storage jars were in the lower hull, secured against movement, sealed against contamination. Each day's allowance was drawn from them in the morning and distributed in smaller vessels that the men were responsible for managing through the day. The allowance was not generous. It was calculated at the minimum required for function in the expected temperatures, with a reserve that existed as insurance against the voyage running longer than planned. Everyone on board knew the water situation without being told the numbers. This was one of the consistent features of life on a small vessel. Certain categories of information became ambient, absorbed through proximity rather than instruction. You could feel the weight of the ship change as the water jars emptied over the course of a voyage, the hull sitting fractionally higher, the handling subtly different in ways that a trained body registered before a conscious mind computed. The crew drank their allowance and did not discuss the jars. Discussing them would not change them. The cook, the compact man in his 40s who occupied the small fire area near the stern, worked within constraints so familiar to him that he no longer experienced them as constraints. He had provisioned the ship himself in consultation with the merchant, and the list of available ingredients was entirely in his head. What he produced each day was not creative in any meaningful sense. It was an optimization problem with a fixed set of variables and a single output requirement. Keep 20 men functional for the duration. He was good at this. He had been good at it long enough that good at it had stopped being a description and become simply what he was. There was one small exception to the communal provisions. The merchant had a separate supply of items that were not shared with the crew, not extravagantly different from what the men ate, but different enough to mark his status in a way that required no announcement. A better grade of dried meat. A small quantity of wine that was reserved for his meals alone. Honey in a sealed jar. These were not luxuries in the context of what was available to him on land. At sea, in the context of the communal provisions surrounding them, they were a visible distinction that everyone on board understood and nobody commented on, because the hierarchy that produced this distinction was the same hierarchy that made the voyage possible at all. The young man ate his meal at the bow, where he had spent the last hour of his watch. The flatbread was harder than bread should be, and the fish required more chewing than he was used to. He ate all of it without hesitation, because the senior sailor who had assigned him to the bow watch had made clear the previous evening, in a tone that did not invite discussion, that men who did not eat adequately were men who made mistakes, and men who made mistakes on this ship made them at everyone's expense. The instruction had been delivered once. It did not need to be delivered again. By mid-morning, the wind had returned, lighter than the previous day, but steady, from a direction that required a slight adjustment to the sail trim, but did not fundamentally alter the course. The coast continued its presence to the east, not the dramatic limestone cliffs of the previous day, but lower ground now, scrubby vegetation coming down close to the water, the hills behind it gentler and less defined. A different character of coast, less hostile to approach, but also less useful as a navigational landmark, the features less distinct and therefore less readable at a distance. The captain had compensated by increasing the frequency of his position checks, small moments of sustained observation that the crew had learned to give space to without being asked. The physical demands of the voyage were beginning to settle into a pattern. The work was not continuous in the way that dock work or farming was continuous. There were stretches where the sail was set and the course was holding, and the sea was cooperative, and the ship simply ran, requiring presence and attention, but not constant physical effort. These stretches were deceptive. They felt like rest, but were not rest, because the attention required to maintain them was its own form of expenditure, quieter than hauling rope, less visible than rowing, but cumulative in a way that showed up later when you needed to be sharp and found you had been paying a tax you had not noticed collecting. The experienced men managed this through habits so ingrained they looked like personality traits. One of the senior sailors had a practice of closing his eyes for short intervals during the passive stretches, not sleeping, something shorter than sleep, a brief withdrawal of attention from the external world that he emerged from slightly more present than he had been before. Another ate small amounts throughout the day rather than at the communal meal times, maintaining a level of energy that never peaked and never dropped significantly. A third moved constantly when he was on deck, small movements with no apparent purpose except to keep the body engaged and the circulation active. The young man observed these habits without commenting on them. He was building a picture of how to do this, not the seamanship, which he was learning through direct instruction and direct consequence, but the management of self across time, the maintenance of function over days and weeks in conditions that were designed by circumstance rather than comfort. Nobody was going to teach him this part explicitly. It was learned by watching people who had already solved the problem and noting what they did. By afternoon, the flatbread from Tyre was finished. The cook had anticipated this and had already begun producing the next batch, working with a small portable clay oven that occupied its designated space near the stern fire area with the settled authority of an object that knew exactly where it belonged. The smell of baking bread moved across the deck in a way that was disproportionately affecting, not because anyone was desperately hungry, but because the smell was specific, warm, connected in every man's nervous system to something prior to this voyage, to kitchens and houses, and the kind of stationary life that the ship was currently the furthest possible thing from. Nobody mentioned this either. The water jars were at their first day's draw below the fill line. The food was adequate and would remain adequate for the foreseeable stretch of the voyage. The men were functional, the hierarchy was intact, the ship was on course. These were the conditions that a well-run voyage looked like from the inside during its early days. Not comfort, not ease, but the absence of the specific problems that made voyages fail. The captain knew better than to find this reassuring. The absence of current problems was not a prediction about future ones. It was simply the present state, accurate only for now, subject to revision without notice. The coast ahead curved slightly to the west. Around that curve, according to the captain's internal map, was a small anchorage used by coastal traders for generations, a place to stop if stopping became necessary, to take on water if the calculation required it, to wait out weather that made the next stretch of coast dangerous to approach. They would pass it without stopping. The provisions did not require it, and the weather did not demand it. But knowing it was there changed the quality of the water ahead in a way that was real, even if it was entirely psychological. The sea between here and a known refuge was a different sea than open water with nothing behind it. The young man did not know about the anchorage ahead. He would not be told about it until they had passed it. Information on this ship moved on a need-to-know basis that was not formal policy but practical habit. You learned what was relevant to your current function, and the rest accumulated as you took on more function. For now, his function was the bow, the watch, the meal, the work assigned to him. The larger picture was being managed by people whose job it was to manage it. His job was to be reliable in the part of it that was his. He was beginning to understand that this was not a lesser form of participation. It was the foundation everything else rested on. The sky on the third morning was wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate and impossible to ignore. Not dramatically wrong. There was no single feature that announced itself as a warning. It was a wrongness built from accumulation, from the specific combination of cloud height and color, and the way the light came through it, flattened and slightly yellowish in a register that experienced eyes associated with particular kinds of incoming weather. The captain had been awake since before dawn. He had seen the sky develop from darkness into this, and he had spent the intervening time being very still and very attentive in the way that preceded decisions with significant consequences. The barometric signs available to an ancient navigator were not the instruments of later centuries. There was no device to consult, no number to read, no threshold value that triggered a protocol. What existed instead was a lifetime of embodied observation, the body as instrument, trained by exposure and outcome to recognize patterns that the conscious mind could not always articulate, but that produced reliable physical responses. A tightness in the chest that was not anxiety but information. A change in the quality of sound that the ear registered before the mind named it. The way the birds were behaving over the coast, or rather, the way they were not behaving, the absence of the normal morning activity over the shoreline that suggested something in the air, had already communicated what the sky was still only hinting at. The captain called the senior sailors to the stern before the morning meal. The conversation was short and conducted in low voices, though there was no one close enough to overhear it who was not meant to. The other crew members were aware of the gathering without making their awareness visible, a collective peripheral attention, each man going about his morning tasks while tracking the meeting at the stern with the part of his mind that was always monitoring the ship's social weather alongside its meteorological kind. What the captain laid out was not a crisis. It was a probability assessment, delivered to the men whose job it was to help him act on it. Weather was coming. The direction and severity were not yet determinable, but the signs pointed towards something from the southwest, arriving within a day, possibly less. The coast here offered one viable anchorage in the next 6 hours of sailing, a bay the captain knew well, deep enough for the hull, protected on 3 sides, with holding ground that had never failed him. The alternative was to push north and hoped to clear the exposed headland before the weather arrived, reaching calmer water on the far side where the coast turned and offered better natural shelter. The risk in the second option was the headland itself, open to the southwest, no shelter, a lee shore in a southwesterly blow. The senior sailors listened without interrupting. When the captain finished, one of them asked a single question about the holding ground in the bay, whether the bottom was sand or rock in the section nearest the southern headland. The captain answered without hesitation. Sand to rock at around 12 cubits depth, reliable in anything short of a gale from the south. The man nodded once. No further questions. The meeting ended. The merchant had watched the meeting from amidships. He approached the captain afterward, when the senior sailors had dispersed, and the two men stood together at the rail in a conversation that lasted longer than the one with the crew had. The merchant's concern was the schedule. The bay meant delay. Delay meant a later arrival at the first trading port. A later arrival meant the market conditions that had been true when they left Tyre might have shifted by the time they got there. He did not say any of this directly. He framed it as a question about the captain's confidence in the weather reading, which was a more sophisticated form of the same concern, and which the captain recognized immediately for what it was. The captain's answer was patient and specific. He described what he had seen in the sky since before dawn. He described the bird behavior over the coast. He described the change in swell period that the night watch had reported and that he had verified himself. He described what a southwesterly blow would do to the hull if they were on the exposed side of the northern headland when it arrived. He did not raise his voice. He did not express impatience with the question. He simply made the information available in enough detail that the merchant could assess it himself, because the merchant was an intelligent man who responded better to evidence than to authority. The merchant was quiet for a moment after the captain finished. Then he asked how long they would need to wait in the bay. The captain said he did not know. It depended on how long the weather lasted and how long the sea needed to settle after it passed. A day, possibly two. The merchant absorbed this. He looked at the sky for a moment with the expression of a man applying a different kind of expertise to the same information and arriving at a different but compatible conclusion. Then he nodded and walked back to his position amidships. The decision was made. The crew felt the decision before it was announced. A subtle shift in the ship's handling as the captain altered course slightly toward the coast. The bow coming around to the east in a way that anyone paying attention could read as a turn toward land rather than a continuation of the northern track. Nobody asked. The senior sailors moved to their positions, and the rest of the crew followed their lead, each man orienting himself to the new heading with the practiced adaptability of people who had learned that the sea rewarded flexibility and punished the insistence on original plans. The young man at the bow felt the course change through the hull before he saw it in the water. The angle of the swell against the keel shifted, the bow beginning to rise and fall on a slightly different axis as the ship turned to meet the waves at a new angle. He looked back toward the stern and saw the captain at the steering oar, his attention forward, his posture carrying the particular quality of concentrated calm that the young man had already learned to read as a signal that things were being managed, but that the margin for error had decreased. He turned back to the water ahead and sharpened his attention accordingly. The clouds to the southwest had changed during the morning meeting. Not enormously, but the base had dropped, the definition between cloud and sky becoming less distinct, the light continuing its yellowish flattening into something that pressed down on the water rather than reflecting off it. The wind had not yet increased, which was in some ways more unsettling than if it had. An approaching weather system that was still suppressing the surface wind was a system that was building energy rather than releasing it. When that energy released, it would do so with the accumulated force of everything that had been held back. The experienced sailors on deck understood this. Their movements had acquired a quality of deliberateness that was distinct from their usual efficiency. The same tasks performed with the same competence, but with a slightly different intention behind them. Everything secured a little more firmly, every loose item stowed rather than left for later. The anchorage was 3 hours away at current speed. The weather, in the captain's assessment, was 4 to 6 hours away. The margin was real but not comfortable. Enough time to reach shelter before the blow arrived, provided nothing slowed them, and the weather did not accelerate beyond what the signs currently suggested. The captain did not share this calculation with the crew. He shared the course and the destination and the implicit expectation that everything would be done at maximum efficiency until further notice. The crew read the rest from his posture and the sky and the behavior of the senior sailors, and they responded the way competent people respond to accurate information, by adjusting their behavior to match the actual situation rather than the one they would have preferred. The young man worked through the morning with the specific focus of someone who has understood that this is not a drill. The water ahead of the bow was darker now, the surface texture changed by the suppressed wind into a low, oily swell that looked different from anything he had seen in the previous 2 days. He reported it to the stern, not as alarm, but as observation, the way he had been told to. One of the senior sailors came forward, looked at the water for a moment, said it was normal ahead of this kind of weather, and returned to the stern without further comment. The young man catalogued the information. Normal ahead of this kind of weather. He stored the phrase and the associated visual for later use, when later would come, and the phrase would be needed from inside rather than borrowed from someone else. The coast ahead was resolving from a general shape into specific features as they approached. A headland to the north, lower ground curving east, and between them the opening of the bay that the captain was aiming for. It was not visible yet as a bay, only as a slight recession in the coastline, a softening of the hard line where land met water. The captain had been navigating toward it from memory, from the accumulated knowledge of previous passages, from the internal map that had no physical form but was more reliable in his hands than any drawn chart could have been. He could see the opening now. The bay was there. Behind them, to the southwest, the horizon had disappeared. Not in darkness, in cloud, a solid wall of it moving toward them at a pace that was now measurable, the edge of it advancing against the sky with the unhurried certainty of something that did not need to hurry, because the outcome was not in question. Only the timing was in question, and the timing for the next 3 hours was everything. They made the bay with less than an hour to spare. The anchor went down in 14 cubits of water over sand, exactly where the captain had said it would be, and the hull swung to face the incoming weather with the particular purposefulness of a vessel that has found its temporary ground and committed to it. The sail came down immediately. Every loose item on deck was secured or stowed below. The work was fast, and without wasted motion, the crew moving through a sequence they had rehearsed, often enough that the rehearsal was invisible inside the execution. The first gusts reached them while they were still working. Not the full weight of the weather. Advanced scouts of it, irregular and probing, arriving from different directions in quick succession as the wind found its way around the headland and into the bay in confused, contradictory pulses. They were strong enough to be taken seriously. The men braced against them without breaking their work rhythm, leaning into each gust and resuming their task as it passed, operating in the grammar of people who had learned that weather did not respond to urgency, and that urgency in response to weather was a form of wasted energy. Then the main body of it arrived. The transition from the gusts to the sustained wind was not gradual. It was a wall, a hard, definitive increase in pressure that arrived all at once and simply stayed. The air moving at a speed that converted sound into something physical, that made standing upright on deck a task requiring conscious effort, that reduced speech to short necessary phrases delivered at close range and raised volume. The bay absorbed the worst of it, the headlands on either side breaking the fetch, limiting the wave height that the wind could generate within the protected water, but absorbed was not eliminated. The hull moved on its anchor chain with a restless, irregular energy, pulling and swinging as the gusts varied in strength, the bow riding up on each wave and driving down into the trough behind it with a force that sent spray across the entire deck. Rain came with the wind. Not a gradual onset. It arrived the same way the wind had, fully formed, heavy and driven horizontal, by the gusts, so that the distinction between rain falling and water moving through the air became academic. Within minutes, everything on deck was soaked: the wood, the rope, the men. The temperature had dropped significantly from the morning, not to cold exactly, but to the kind of wet chill that works differently than dry cold, that penetrates clothing faster and lingers in the body longer and requires more energy to manage. The crew pulled what additional covering they had and moved to the positions they could maintain with the least exposure, staying low, staying still, staying on board. The anchor held. This was the central fact of the next several hours, the fact that everything else depended on, and that could not be taken for granted until it had been continuously confirmed by the continued presence of the hull in the same position relative to the shore. The captain monitored it constantly, checking the angle of the chain, checking the position of the headlands against fixed reference points on the horizon, running the calculation of holding ground against applied force in a continuous loop that admitted no interruption and no conclusion other than a temporary one. If the anchor dragged, they would know it first in the changed angle of the chain, then in the slow drift of the headlands against their reference points, then in the reduced depth under the keel as the shore approached. He watched for all three simultaneously and reported none of them, which meant none of them were happening, which was the only news worth having. Below deck, the men who were not needed above had retreated to the relative shelter of the hull's interior. Relative was the operative word. The motion of the ship in the anchorage was transmitted through every plank and beam of the structure, a continuous, complex movement that combined the surging pull of the anchor chain with the lateral roll driven by the wind and the up and down of the wave action, producing a compound motion that the body could not find a pattern in and therefore could not fully accommodate. Some of the men were seasick. Not dramatically, this was not their first experience of rough water, but present, a low-grade nausea that sat in the background of everything and required management rather than treatment. They managed it by staying still, by keeping their eyes on fixed points, by eating nothing and drinking carefully, by the various personal strategies that each man had developed through previous exposure to the same problem. The young man was not seasick. He had not been certain he would escape it. The coastal runs he had done before had not produced conditions anything like this, and the relationship between previous experience and current vulnerability was not straightforward. But his body, it turned out, had a tolerance for motion that the current conditions did not exceed. He was aware of this as a piece of information about himself, filed alongside the discovery about his quality of attention at the bow, building a picture of what he was actually capable of as distinct from what he had assumed he might be. Neither piece of information made him confident. Confidence was not the appropriate response to new data. Noting it accurately was. The cargo was his concern for part of the afternoon. Not because he had been assigned to it, but because the motion of the hull had caused one of the larger ceramic jars to shift in its stowing, the movement small but enough to create a repetitive knock against the adjacent timber that nobody else had located yet. He found it, traced the sound to its source, and wedged the jar back into position with a piece of spare timber from the stowage. The knocking stopped. He checked the surrounding cargo for other movement, found nothing, and returned to his position. Nobody had seen him do it. The jar did not shift again. Above deck, the wind reached its peak in the early afternoon and held there for 2 hours that felt like longer. The gusts within the sustained wind were violent enough that the men on deck moved only when necessary, and did so with one hand always in contact with something fixed. The noise was total, wind and water, and the constant percussion of the hull working in the seaway, the creaking of the anchor chain, the sound of the spray hitting the deck with a force that was not rain but not quite wave, the in-between category of weather that a ship at anchor in a blow inhabited. Conversation was impossible at any distance. The crew communicated by proximity and gesture, the compressed language of people operating in conditions that had removed most of their usual tools. The captain stood at the stern through most of it. Not because standing was comfortable, it was not, but because his position at the stern gave him the clearest view of the anchor chain angle and the best sightlines to the reference points he was using to monitor the hull's position. He stood with his feet wide and his weight low, and his eyes moving between chain and headland and horizon in a rotation that did not vary regardless of what the weather did. The merchant had retreated below after the first hour. The captain had not moved. In the middle of the worst of it, a sound came from the bow that was different from the general noise of the storm. A crack, sharp, distinct, cutting through the ambient roar in a way that brought every man on deck to immediate attention. The captain was moving before the sound had fully registered, forward along the deck, low, one hand on the rail, reaching the bow in seconds. The young man was already there. He had been closest and had arrived first, and was standing over the source of the sound with an expression that was not panic, but was the thing immediately adjacent to panic that competent people produce when they have identified a serious problem and have not yet determined whether they can address it. A timber at the bow had cracked under the stress of the repeated wave impacts. Not catastrophically, the hull was not breached. The structural integrity of the bow was not immediately compromised. But the crack was real, and it was in a place that would worsen under continued stress, and that would need to be addressed before the vessel went back to open water. The captain examined it in the time it took the next wave to reach them, his hands on the timber, reading the damage the way he read everything, through direct contact, through accumulated knowledge, through the instantaneous comparison of what he was feeling against everything he had felt before. He straightened up and called one of the senior sailors forward by name. The repair would wait until the weather eased. There was nothing to be done in current conditions that would hold. The movement of the hull was too continuous, the wet too total, the ability to work with precision too compromised. What could be done now was a temporary measure, rope bound tightly around the cracked section to limit further movement, relieving the stress on the fracture until proper work was possible. The captain and the young man and the senior sailor did this together in the full force of the weather. 3 men working in close proximity at the bow, with the spray coming over them, and the hull rising and dropping beneath their feet, tying the rope with the kind of focus that reduces the world to the immediate task and nothing else. When it was done, the captain looked at the young man for a moment, not long, not with any particular expression, and then returned to the stern. The senior sailor clapped the young man once on the shoulder, hard, and followed. The young man stayed at the bow and watched the storm, and kept his hand on the bound timber, and felt the rope holding under each impact, and did not move until the wind began, almost imperceptibly, to ease. The storm left the way storms always leave, not all at once, but in stages, each stage requiring confirmation before it could be trusted. The wind dropped first, from sustained violence to irregular gusting, from gusting to something that was merely strong, from strong to the kind of brisk movement of air that on any other day would have seemed unremarkable. The rain thinned and then stopped, leaving the air with the specific clarity that follows heavy weather, washed clean of everything that had been suspended in it. The colors of the coast sharper than they had been before the storm. The water in the bay a strange luminous green, where the sun was beginning to find its way through the breaking cloud. The sea inside the bay took longer to settle than the wind. This was always the case. The water held the energy of the storm in its motion after the generating force had passed. The waves continuing to arrive from the southwest at reduced but still significant height, running into the bay and reflecting off the headlands, and interfering with each other in patterns that made the hull's motion unpredictable for hours after the worst was over. The anchor chain remained taut. The captain remained at the stern. The crew remained in their positions. The storm being technically over did not mean the situation was resolved. Assessment came before anything else. Before the meal that everyone needed, before the rest that the night watch had been denied, before any discussion of when to leave and what course to take, the ship needed to be examined systematically for damage that the storm had inflicted or revealed. The captain conducted this himself, starting at the bow and working aft, his hands on every significant piece of timber, his eyes on every joint and seam and fastening, his attention moving through the vessel the way a physician moves through a patient, methodically, without assumption, noting what he found without deciding what it meant until he had the complete picture. The bow timber was the most significant finding. The temporary rope binding had held through the worst of the storm, limiting the movement of the crack and preventing it from propagating further into the surrounding wood. But the crack itself was substantial, a diagonal fracture running across the grain in a section that bore significant load when the bow met waves at speed. Running to open water without addressing it properly was not an option the captain was willing to consider. The repair would require time, specific materials, and conditions calm enough to work with precision. All three of those requirements would take at least a full day to satisfy. Beyond the bow, the damage was less structural and more practical. Two of the sail's lower lashings had parted under the load of the storm, not critical while the sail was down, but requiring replacement before the sail could be trusted at sea in any significant wind. Several deck fittings had worked loose, their fastenings pulled by the repeated violent motion of the hull. One of the water jars in the lower hold had cracked, not the main storage vessels, but a secondary jar used for daily distribution, spilling a quantity of water into the bilge that had to be calculated against the remaining supply and factored into the schedule for the rest of the voyage. The captain stood over the cracked jar for a moment and ran the numbers in silence. The cargo had survived largely intact. The careful loading entire, the weight distribution, the specific securing of fragile items, all of it had done its job. The merchant conducted his own inspection of the hold, moving through it with a lamp and a focused attention that mirrored the captain's examination of the hull. He emerged after half an hour with an expression that communicated controlled relief. The purple cloth was undamaged. The glass vessels were intact. The cedar oil jars had held their seals. The metal goods had shifted slightly, but sustained no damage. The unnamed item in its wrappings was exactly where it had been placed. He checked it last and said nothing about it afterward, as he had said nothing about it before. The meal that followed the assessment was different from the previous meals in a quality that was hard to name precisely. The food was the same. The cook had maintained his routine throughout the storm, with a stubbornness that the crew had registered as a form of reassurance, even if none of them would have described it that way. What was different was the quality of attention the men brought to eating it. The storm had been, for most of them, not frightening in a way that produced visible fear. They were too experienced for that, but demanding in a way that had consumed a significant portion of their reserves. The meal was the first moment since the weather arrived when the body was permitted to relax its vigilance and attend to its own needs. They ate with the focused pleasure of people who have been reminded that pleasure is not guaranteed. The young man sat with the senior sailor who had helped bind the bow timber. They did not speak much during the meal. The older man was not a conversationalist under normal circumstances, and the shared experience of the repair had not changed that. But there was a difference in the space between them from the day before, a slight reduction in the distance that hierarchy and unfamiliarity create, produced not by words, but by the simple fact of having worked together in difficult conditions, and both having done it adequately. The young man was aware of the shift without drawing attention to it. The older man gave no indication of being aware of anything at all. Repair work began in the afternoon, when the bay had settled enough to allow the hull to be worked without the motion defeating the effort. The bow timber repair was the priority. The technique used was not sophisticated by later standards, but was effective within its constraints. The cracked section backed with a secondary piece of timber bolted through both. The crack itself filled with a mixture of pine resin and ground material that hardened as it cured. The whole assembly bound with rope under tension that would distribute the load across the repair rather than concentrating it at the fracture. The work required 3 men and most of the afternoon. The young man was one of them. He worked under direction, doing what he was told when he was told to do it, keeping his attention on the specific task in front of him rather than the larger operation he was contributing to. This was the correct approach, and he had not needed to be instructed in it. He had understood intuitively that in skilled work being done by people more experienced than himself, his job was precision in execution rather than initiative in direction. He held what needed holding, applied pressure when pressure was called for, passed materials with the timing that the work required. When the repair was finished and the senior sailor ran his hands across it and said nothing, no comment, no evaluation, just moved on to the next task, the young man understood that this was the equivalent of approval. The water loss from the cracked jar was recalculated into the voyage plan. The captain and the merchant stood together over this calculation in a conversation that was more collaborative than most of their exchanges had been. The storm had apparently adjusted the dynamic between them in some small way, the shared experience of the anchorage producing a temporary alignment of perspective that their separate interests usually prevented. They agreed on a modified water allowance for the crew, a reduction small enough to be manageable, large enough to extend the supply to cover the delay and maintain the planned margin to destination. The crew was informed simply and without apology. The allowance was what it was. As the sun dropped toward the western headland, the bay had returned to something close to its pre-storm state. The water was calm enough that the hull's motion was minimal, the anchor chain hanging at a gentle angle rather than the taut line it had maintained through the blow. The repairs were complete. The sail lashings had been replaced. The deck fittings had been tightened. The bilge had been pumped of the water that had accumulated through the storm and the cracked jar. The ship was functional, not unmarked by what had happened. The bow repair was visible, a new piece of timber against the older wood, but functional. The captain sat at the stern in the evening light and looked at the open water beyond the bay entrance. The southwest horizon was clear now, the storm having moved on to wherever storms went after they were finished with you. The sea beyond the headlands had the post-storm texture of water that had been thoroughly worked and was now settling back into its default state, a long residual swell still running from the southwest, but organized now, regular, the kind of swell that a well-found ship managed without difficulty. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the sky above it, reading what was there with the same systematic attention he brought to everything. Tomorrow they would leave the bay. The delay had cost them a day and a half, a water jar, and a section of bow timber. It had also, though this was not a calculation anyone on board would have made explicitly, given them information they had not had before, about the ship's behavior in heavy weather, about the repair techniques that worked and those that did not, about which men on the crew were reliable under pressure and which required more support than they had shown during the calm days. That information had value. It would be used, in ways both conscious and not, for the rest of the voyage. The young man sat at the bow in the last of the evening light, with his hand resting on the repaired timber. The resin was still slightly tacky under his fingers. The rope binding held firm. He could feel the residual motion of the bay transmitted through the wood. Gentle now, almost rhythmic. Nothing like the violence that had tested it hours before. He thought about the crack, about the sound it had made cutting through the storm noise, about the 3 seconds between hearing it and knowing what it was, and deciding what to do. 3 seconds was not a long time. It had felt like considerably more. He filed that too. They left the bay before dawn on the second day. The captain had made the decision the previous evening and communicated it through the watch rotation assignments, a sequence that told the experienced men everything they needed to know about the timing without requiring it to be stated directly. The anchor came up in darkness, the chain heavy with bay mud that the men cleaned as it came aboard, working by feel, and the faint pre-dawn light that was not yet enough to see by, but was enough to distinguish the chain from the water it emerged from. The sail went up into a sky that was still more black than blue. They were moving before the sun cleared the eastern hills. The sea beyond the bay entrance was exactly what the captain had read the previous evening. The residual swell from the southwest, long and organized, running under a wind that had settled back into the northwest after the storm had exhausted itself. The hull met it at an angle that was not comfortable, but was entirely manageable. The bow rising on each swell and driving forward into the trough with a purposeful momentum that felt different from the passive running of the first days. The ship had been tested and had held. There was a quality to its motion now that the crew registered without discussing, a slightly increased confidence in the way they worked the sail and managed the course, the kind of adjustment that comes from knowing what a vessel will do under pressure, because you have recently watched it do exactly that. The coast they were leaving behind had no name in any record that survives. It was a stretch of the Levantine shoreline, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what the bay had provided. Shelter at the right moment, holding ground that had not failed, enough protection to make the repair possible. The captain did not look back at it as they cleared the headland. He had noted it, used it, and was now moving past it with the same forward orientation that governed everything about how he operated. The past was information. The sea ahead was the problem. By mid-morning, they had regained the northward track, and the familiar rhythm of coastal sailing had reasserted itself. The reading of headlands, the monitoring of depth through watercolor, the continuous low-level assessment of wind and sky that never stopped but settled, in good conditions, into a background process rather than a foreground one. The crew moved through the day with the particular quality of people who have absorbed a disruption and returned to function, not unchanged, but not visibly marked either. The storm present in small behavioral adjustments rather than in anything that could be pointed to directly. Cyprus appeared on the third day after leaving the bay. Not dramatically. The island did not announce itself with cliffs or a dramatic skyline. It arrived as a low suggestion on the northwestern horizon, a thickening of the boundary between sea and sky that took several hours to resolve into something that could be called land with confidence. The captain had been expecting it at approximately this position and approximately this time, and its appearance confirmed the accuracy of his navigation over the preceding days, a satisfaction that he registered internally and expressed externally as nothing at all. Cyprus was not an incidental stop. It was a central node in the Phoenician commercial network, an island whose copper deposits had made it economically significant for longer than anyone on the ship had been alive. The name of the island was, in the languages of the ancient world, essentially synonymous with the metal. The Latin word for copper derived from the island rather than the other way around, a linguistic trace of how thoroughly Cyprus and its primary export had been identified with each other in the ancient mind. The Phoenicians had been trading there for generations, and in some of the island's ports they were not visitors but residents, established communities that had been present long enough to become part of the local commercial and social fabric. The port they were headed for was on the southern coast, a harbor the merchant knew well, where he had contacts whose reliability he had assessed over multiple previous voyages and found adequate. Adequate in the merchant's vocabulary was not faint praise. It meant people who honored agreements, who did not inflate prices beyond what the market genuinely supported, who did not ask questions about items in the cargo that were not their business. In the commercial world of the ancient Mediterranean, reliability of this kind was worth more than warmth, and considerably rarer. The approach to the harbor took most of the afternoon. The southern coast of Cyprus was not technically difficult to navigate, but required attention. Shoals extended further from the shore than the watercolor always made clear, and the harbor entrance was narrow enough that the approach needed to be made on a specific heading that the captain had committed to memory from previous visits. He brought the ship in without incident, reading the entrance from a distance and adjusting the course incrementally as the features resolved, the kind of precision navigation that looked casual and was not. The crew watched the process with the appreciation of people who understood what they were watching. The harbor was smaller than Tyre, but organized on the same functional principles: working quays, storage facilities close to the water, the infrastructure of a port that existed to move goods rather than to impress visitors. Other ships were moored along the quay, 2 coastal traders smaller than their vessel, and one larger ship whose line suggested an origin further west, possibly from the Aegean or beyond. The larger ship's crew were visible on deck, watching the Phoenician vessel come in with the particular attention of sailors assessing an arrival, reading the hull, the sail, the condition of the rigging, drawing conclusions about where the ship had been and what it had encountered that the crew themselves had not volunteered. The Phoenician crew returned the assessment with equal discretion. Lines went to the dock and were made fast with the same practiced efficiency that had characterized everything on this voyage. The captain stepped ashore first, as was customary, and stood on the quay for a moment with the slight awkwardness of a man whose body had spent days adjusting to motion and now had to readjust to stillness. The merchant followed, moving immediately toward the upper part of the harbor where the trading contacts maintained their premises, his attention already ahead of his feet, already in the conversation that would determine what happened to the cargo. He did not look back at the ship. The ship was the captain's domain. The dock was his. The young man stepped onto Cypriot ground and stood still for a moment, feeling the solidity of it under his feet, with the slight disorientation that solid ground produced after days at sea. The harbor smelled different from Tyre, the same fundamental harbor smell, but with different top notes, different proportions of salt and fish, and the particular smell of the local trade goods, copper ore, and the byproducts of its smelting carrying on the air from somewhere further inland. He looked up at the town above the harbor, low white buildings stepping up a hillside, a market visible at the edge of the quay, people moving with the unhurried directness of people in a working port who had things to do and were doing them. A different place. The same kind of place. The crew were given the remainder of the afternoon and the evening ashore, a concession that the captain offered without elaboration, and the crew received without excessive gratitude. It was a practical necessity as much as a generosity, the men needing the psychological reset that land provided, the opportunity to move on solid ground and eat food that was not from the ship's provisions, and exist briefly in a social context that was not the confined world of 20 men in a small hull. Some went immediately to the harbor taverns. Some went to the market. Some simply walked, following no particular direction, putting distance between themselves and the water with a purposefulness that suggested the distance was itself the point. The young man walked up through the town to where the buildings ended and the hillside began, and sat there in the late afternoon light, looking back down at the harbor. The ship was visible from there, small from this distance, sitting low at the quay, the repaired bow facing him across the water. It looked different from this vantage point than it did from the inside of it. Smaller, for one thing. More contingent. A thing sitting in the world among other things, dependent on its environment in ways that were not visible when you were inside it managing those dependencies in real time. He looked at it for a while. Then he looked at the sea beyond the harbor mouth, already darkening as the sun dropped behind the island's western hills. The trading meeting was happening somewhere in the town behind him. The merchant was sitting across from his contact, and words were being exchanged that would determine the value of the purple cloth and the glass and the cedar oil and the worked metal. Words that would translate weeks of sailing and a storm and a cracked bow timber into numbers in a ledger that nobody on the ship's crew would ever see. That was the transaction at the center of everything. That was what the voyage was for. He had known this before he boarded. Sitting on the hillside above a Cypriot harbor in the fading light, he understood it differently than he had before, not as an abstraction, but as a structure. He was now inside one of its working parts, functioning as designed. Below, a lamp came on aboard the ship. Then another. The harbor began its evening transformation, the working day folding into the social night with the ease of a place that had been doing this for centuries. He would need to be back at the ship before the watch rotation started. He had time yet. He stayed on the hillside a little longer, in the last of the light, with the sea below him and the town behind him, and the voyage only half finished and everything that the second half would require still entirely unknown. The negotiation had started the previous evening and was not finished by morning. This was not unusual. A transaction of this scale, purple cloth, worked glass, cedar oil, bronze goods, all of it arriving after a delayed voyage with a specific buyer waiting and specific inventory the seller needed to move, did not resolve in a single conversation. It resolved through a sequence of conversations in which each party established what they knew, what they needed, and what they were willing to concede, in an order carefully managed to ensure that the concessions, when they came, appeared to be responses to argument rather than products of a predetermined position. The merchant was experienced at this. His contact in Cyprus was equally experienced. The negotiation would take the time it needed to take. The captain used the morning for provisioning. Water first. The cracked jar had reduced their margin, and Cyprus offered good fresh water sources that the harbour traders knew how to access efficiently for a price that the captain had negotiated on previous visits and knew how to hold to. The large storage jars were brought up from the hold and carried to a water source near the upper harbour, filled, resealed, and returned with the assistance of 3 crew members, who did this work with the methodical patience of men who understood that water was not an abstraction. Every jar that went back into the hold was a concrete extension of how far the ship could go before it needed to stop again. Food was replenished alongside the water. Fresh provisions were available. The cook moved through the harbour market with the selective attention of someone who had been doing this in ports across the eastern Mediterranean for decades, knowing which sellers could be trusted and which could not, knowing the difference between fresh and freshly presented, knowing that the price asked in a port where Phoenician ships were regular visitors was not the price available to someone who knew how to negotiate in the local commercial register. He came back to the ship with dried figs, grain, a quantity of cured meat from a source he approved of, and several items that were Cyprus-specific and would not be available further along the route. He said nothing about any of it. He stowed it and returned to his fire area and began the work of incorporating the new provisions into his calculations for the remaining voyage. The repair to the bow timber was inspected in the morning light by the captain and found to be holding correctly. The resin had cured overnight in the warm air of the Cypriot harbour, achieving the hardness that made it functional rather than provisional. The backing timber was solid, the rope binding tight, the fracture immobilized within its repair in a way that the captain assessed as adequate for open water in normal conditions. Not ideal. Ideal would have been a full replacement of the cracked section, which would have required a shipwright and several days, and was not possible here without significant delay. Adequate for the remaining voyage was the standard he was working to, and the repair met it. The negotiation reached its first crisis point in the late morning. The merchant emerged from his contact's premises with an expression that communicated controlled frustration, the particular compression of a man who has heard a number he considers insulting and is deciding how to respond to it without allowing his response to be dictated by the insult. He walked to the quay and stood there for several minutes looking at the water, running calculations that had nothing to do with navigation. The captain, who was on deck overseeing the restowing of the water jars, observed this without comment. The merchant's commercial difficulties were not his domain. The relevant question was how long the resolution of those difficulties would take, and whether the delay would affect the departure timing he had already established in his mind. The purple cloth was the sticking point. The Cypriot contact had offered a price that reflected a market that had shifted since the merchant's information had been current. A competitor had arrived in the port 2 weeks earlier with a smaller quantity of comparable cloth and had sold it at a price that had adjusted local expectations downward. The merchant had not known about this. The contact had known that the merchant had not known, and had timed the revelation for maximum effect in the negotiation. It was a competent move, and the merchant recognized it as such, which did not make it less frustrating. He returned to the premises after his interval at the quay with a revised approach. The cloth price was not the only price being negotiated. The glass, the cedar oil, the bronze goods all had their own values, and the total transaction could be structured in ways that distributed concession and gain across the full inventory, rather than concentrating the loss in the single most visible item. This was not a retreat from his position on the cloth. It was a reorganization of the ground on which the position stood. The contact understood the move immediately and adjusted his own approach accordingly. The negotiation entered its second phase. Below deck on the ship, the young man was doing inventory work assigned by the senior sailor, checking the securing of the cargo that had been disturbed during the storm, and restowing, accounting for every item against a mental list that the senior sailor had given him verbally that morning. He worked through the hold methodically, checking each item, noting anything that had shifted or showed damage, replacing rope where it had chafed, tightening the wedges that kept ceramic vessels from moving in their stowage positions. It was detailed work that required sustained attention and produced nothing dramatic, no discoveries, no problems, beyond minor ones that could be addressed immediately. He reached the section of the hold where the unnamed item in its wrappings sat in its gap of empty space, checked that it had not moved, and moved on without touching it. Its inventory status was not his to assess. The afternoon brought a development that none of the Phoenician crew had anticipated. The larger vessel moored along the quay, the one with the western lines that had suggested an Aegean origin, sent a man to the ship with a request for a meeting between its captain and the Phoenician captain. The messenger delivered this in Greek, which two of the Phoenician crew understood well enough to convey the request accurately. The captain agreed to the meeting without visible hesitation, which told the crew something about whether the request was unusual. It was apparently not unusual. The two captains met on the quay between their ships, a neutral location that required neither man to be a guest in the other's domain. The conversation lasted about an hour and covered, as far as anyone who watched it could determine from a distance, a range of subjects that included weather, route conditions, the state of various ports along the western Mediterranean track, and the behavior of the sea in the stretch between Cyprus and the island destinations further west. Information of this kind moved between ships at ports the way commercial intelligence moved in markets, selectively, with calculation about what to offer and what to withhold, traded against equivalent information from the other party in an exchange that had its own economy and its own etiquette. Both captains were skilled at this exchange. They parted with a formality that was genuinely cordial without being warm. Two professionals who had conducted a useful transaction and had no further business with each other. What the captain had learned mattered. The western stretch of the route, the open water passage that was still ahead of them, had been described by the other captain as currently unsettled, the residual effects of the same storm system that had pushed them into the bay still generating confused seas in the channel between Cyprus and the next significant landfall. Not impassable, not even particularly dangerous for a well-found ship with an experienced crew, but uncomfortable and slower than the conditions that had prevailed before the storm. The timeline for the rest of the voyage needed to be adjusted. The captain brought this information to the merchant during a break in the negotiation. The timing was deliberate. The merchant was at a point in his discussions where a piece of external information that required processing might actually help him, giving him a legitimate reason to pause the conversation and reconsider his position without appearing to retreat from it. The captain understood the negotiation dynamic well enough to use his news as a tool rather than simply a report. The merchant accepted it with the slight nod of a man who has received both the information and the subtext and found both useful. By early evening, the transaction had reached a structure that both parties could accept. Not the structure the merchant had arrived in Cyprus hoping to achieve. The cloth price remained lower than he had projected. The competitive arrival 2 weeks earlier, having genuinely shifted the market in ways that argument could not fully reverse. But the glass had traded at a premium that partially offset the cloth loss. The cedar oil had found a buyer who valued it for purposes that made him less price-sensitive than the general market, and the bronze goods had gone at the rate the merchant had expected. The unnamed item had not been part of this transaction. It was going further west. To whom and for what purpose remained information that the captain had not asked for and had not been given. The harbour that evening had the particular quality of a place where business had been concluded, and the conclusion had not been entirely satisfying to anyone, which in commercial terms often indicated a fair result. The merchant sat on the quays in the fading light, with a cup of the local wine and an expression that was calculating rather than celebratory. The captain was already aboard, already thinking about the morning departure, already running the route information from the Greek captain against his own knowledge of the Western Passage. The crew moved between ship and shore with the ease of men who had done this at enough ports to know how to exist in the temporary, in-between state of a voyage that has stopped but not ended. They would leave at first light. The sea ahead was unsettled and would require their full attention. Tonight was the last night of the known world for a while. Not every transaction went the way the merchant had described the Cyprus exchange. Difficult, but ultimately resolved. The numbers rearranged until they produced an acceptable outcome. There were failures, and the Phoenician commercial world had developed, over generations of practice, a specific set of responses to them that were as refined and as deliberately constructed as the negotiation techniques that preceded them. Understanding what happened when commerce failed was as important as understanding what happened when it succeeded, because failure was not an exception in this world. It was a regular feature of the landscape, managed rather than avoided, incorporated into the system rather than treated as a breakdown of it. The merchant had not shared the full picture of the Cyprus transaction with the captain. What he had shared was the surface, the prices achieved, the quantities moved, the credit arrangements established for the portion of the payment that would be settled at the destination rather than on the dock. What he had not shared was the complication that had emerged in the final hour of the negotiation, after the captain had delivered his weather information and left the meeting. The Cypriot contact had introduced a condition, a claim against a previous transaction, a debt from an earlier voyage that the merchant acknowledged existed but disputed the amount of, presented now, at the close of a new deal, as an offset against the current payment. This was a recognized tactic in ancient commercial practice. The timing was not accidental, a debt claim introduced at the moment of settlement, when both parties had already invested significant time and were psychologically oriented toward conclusion, created a pressure to resolve the dispute quickly and on terms less favorable than a cold negotiation would have produced. The merchant had seen it before, knowing the tactic did not neutralize it. The pressure it created was real, regardless of whether you could name it. He had accepted a partial offset, less than the contact had claimed, more than he believed was legitimately owed. The difference between those two numbers was the cost of the tactic, the price of maintaining the relationship, the calculation of what future transactions with this contact were worth against the loss absorbed in this one. It was a familiar kind of accounting, conducted in a currency that did not appear in any ledger, but that governed the commercial world as thoroughly as the numbers that did. Trust, obligation, the accumulated credit of reliable behavior over time. These were as real as silver in this world, and their depletion had consequences that outlasted any single transaction. On the ship, the crew knew nothing of this. The cargo that had been offloaded in Cyprus was gone. The payment for it, in whatever form it had taken, was in the merchant's keeping, and the hold was lighter now. The purple cloth, the glass, most of the cedar oil absent, the spaces they had occupied reorganized to maintain the balance of the hull. What remained was the bronze goods, a portion of the cedar oil reserved for a specific buyer further west, and the unnamed item in its wrappings that had traveled through the storm and the repair and the Cyprus negotiation without being touched or discussed or incorporated into any visible accounting. The merchant had been careful about this in the harbour. The contact had not been shown the full contents of the hold, a routine precaution in a commercial world where information about what a ship was carrying was itself a commodity with value. The morning departure from Cyprus was quieter than the departure from Tyre had been. No ritual at the bow shrine, or rather, the ritual happened but briefly, the captain's offering shorter, the words less, as if the relationship with the protecting deity had moved past the stage that required elaborate communication into something more abbreviated and more direct. The lines came off the dock with the same practiced sequence as before. The harbour receded. The island of Cyprus, which had been the horizon for 3 days, became the horizon again, this time behind them rather than ahead, diminishing in the way that all land diminished when you turned away from it and put the sea between yourself and it. The Western Passage opened ahead of them as Cyprus fell back. The Greek captain's description had been accurate. The sea here was not dangerous, but it was disorganized, the residual swell from the storm interfering with a new swell coming from a different direction, producing a confused cross-sea that made the hull's motion irregular and demanded more active management of the sail than the straightforward coastal sailing of the first days had required. The crew adapted without comment, trimming the sail more frequently, anticipating the hull's responses to the irregular motion rather than reacting to them after the fact. It was harder work than the previous stretch had been. It was also the kind of work that maintained sharpness in a crew that had been in port long enough for port habits to begin reasserting themselves. The young man was moved from the bow to a different position for this stretch, working the sail lines under the direction of one of the senior sailors, a role that required more strength and more coordination than the watchwork he had been doing, and that placed him in the center of the ship's active operation rather than at its forward edge. The transition was made without ceremony. One morning he was at the bow, the next he was at the sail lines. No explanation was offered and none was needed. The senior sailor who made the assignment knew what the young man needed to learn next, and the assignment was the instruction. The sail lines were a different education from the bow watch. The bow watch had rewarded patience and sustained passive attention. You watched and you waited and you reported what you saw. The sail lines required active, dynamic response, the body learning to feel the wind's changes through the tension of the rope before the eye could register them in the sail's behavior. It was physical knowledge, built in the muscles and the hands rather than in the mind, and it accumulated differently from the observational knowledge of the bow, faster in some ways, because the feedback was immediate and physical, slower in others, because the body required repetition to encode what the mind could grasp in a single explanation. He made mistakes in the first hours. Nothing catastrophic. The senior sailor was positioned to catch errors before they became problems. But visible, the rope given too much or too little at the wrong moment, the sail losing shape briefly as a result, the hull's momentum interrupted in ways that were minor individually and cumulative in aggregate. Each mistake produced a correction from the senior sailor, delivered in the minimum words required, not harsh, not patient in the performed way that condescension sometimes took, but direct and immediate and then done, The correction made, and the attention moved forward to the next moment, rather than dwelling on the error that had just been addressed. The young man learned to receive corrections the same way. Acknowledge, adjust, continue. No elaboration on either side. The merchant spent the first day out of Cyprus below deck, working through his accounts with the focused immersion of a man processing a transaction that had not gone as planned and needed to be fully understood before the next one began. He emerged in the afternoon, looking neither satisfied nor distressed, wearing the expression of someone who has completed a calculation and accepted the result, regardless of whether the result was what he had hoped for. He stood at the rail for a while, watching the confused sea with the particular gaze of a man who is looking at the present but thinking about the future, running scenarios for the destination ahead that incorporated everything the Cyprus transaction had taught him about the current state of the market. Then he went back below. The calculation apparently required more time. What the merchant was working through, in the accounting below deck, was not just the numbers from Cyprus. It was the larger shape of the voyage, whether the total transaction, when destination was reached and final payment collected, would satisfy the investors back in Tyre, whose money was committed to this enterprise. The cloth price had been lower than projected. The offset claim had reduced the net further. The remaining cargo would need to perform at the high end of what was possible to bring the voyage's total return to within the range that the investors considered acceptable. The unnamed item, wherever it was going, and for whatever price had been arranged for it, carried significant weight in this calculation. The merchant had known this when the voyage began. He knew it more concretely now. The crossed seas eased during the second day out of Cyprus as the residual storm swell dissipated and the northwestern wind established a more consistent pattern. The hull's motion steadied, the sail held its shape with less active management, and the crew moved into the familiar rhythm of open water passage, present, attentive, not strained. The coast of Cyprus had been out of sight since the previous afternoon. Ahead there was nothing visible, only the line where sea became sky in a clean, uninterrupted arc that ran from one edge of the horizon to the other without feature. Open water in every direction except behind them. The kind of exposure that the eastern Mediterranean could produce when the coast finally let you go. The young man stood at the sail lines in the afternoon of the second day and felt the wind in the rope, and made the adjustment before the senior sailor prompted it. A small thing, the correct response to a shift that had been building for several minutes, readable in the rope's tension before it was visible in the sail. The senior sailor, standing a meter away, said nothing, which was not the same as nothing happening. The young man had made the right call from the rope, not from instruction. The senior sailor had registered this and had chosen silence as his response, which in the economy of communication on this ship was a statement of a specific kind. The young man understood it and did not allow himself to react to it visibly. He kept his attention on the rope and the sail and the wind that connected them, and did not look for confirmation that was already present in the silence itself. Open water was a different proposition from coastal sailing in ways that went beyond the absence of land on the horizon. The coast had been a reference system, a continuous external check on position, on heading, on the accumulated drift that wind and current introduced into any vessel's track over time. Without it, the navigation became internal, dependent entirely on the knowledge and judgment of the men running the ship, with no external feature to confirm or correct what they believed about where they were. This was not a new situation for the captain or the senior sailors. It was the situation that separated Phoenician long-distance trading from the coastal cabotage that most Mediterranean sailors of the period practiced exclusively. The stars became primary again. not supplementary, not a backup to coastal navigation, the actual system. The thing the voyage depended on for its accuracy across the open stretches that could not be avoided on the route west. The captain's relationship with the night sky was different from his relationship with the coast, more abstract in some ways, because the stars required interpretation rather than direct reading. The position they indicated arrived at through calculation rather than recognition, but also more reliable in certain respects, because the stars did not have weather-dependent visibility in the same way that coastal features did, and because the patterns they formed were universal, the same stars over the same positions, night after night, season after season, a consistency that the physical world below them could not match. The cloud that had accompanied the post-storm period had cleared on the second day out of Cyprus, leaving the night sky with the particular density and clarity of the open Mediterranean in good conditions. Not the diffuse suburban sky of a port town, but something rawer and more populated. The stars present in numbers that made the darkness between them feel incidental rather than dominant. The captain worked his position from this sky each night with the precision that the voyage required, checking his reading against the known behavior of the current in this part of the sea, against the elapsed time since Cyprus, against the feel of the wind on his face and the angle of the swell under the hull. No single input was sufficient alone. The position was the product of all of them together, weighted by his judgment about the reliability of each. The young man had begun watching the captain's night navigation without being invited to. He positioned himself close enough to observe without close enough to intrude, which was a distinction the captain was aware of and had not discouraged. This itself was a form of permission, though it had not been stated as such. The captain operated on the understanding that knowledge was transmitted through proximity and attention as much as through explicit instruction, and that a man who positioned himself correctly and kept his observations to himself was demonstrating exactly the quality of patience that the work required. He did not explain what he was doing during these night sessions. He did not need to. The young man was learning to watch, which was the prerequisite for learning to understand, which was the prerequisite for everything else. The days on open water had a different texture from the coastal days. Without the coast to read, the primary occupation of the daylight hours became the management of the vessel itself, the sail, the course, the maintenance of the hull and rigging that a working ship required continuously and that the demands of coastal navigation had sometimes displaced as a priority. Rope was inspected and replaced where it showed wear. The sail was examined for stress points developing at the lashing positions. The hull was checked for any change in the bow repair, any new movement in the cracked timber that would require attention before it became serious. These tasks were distributed across the crew without formal assignment, each man gravitating toward the work that matched his competence, the ship's maintenance proceeding as a collective project rather than a directed one. The merchant had emerged from his accounting by the third day out of Cyprus with a settled quality that had been absent since the negotiation. Whatever conclusions he had reached about the voyage's financial picture, he had reached them completely enough to stop running the numbers and start managing the situation they described. He spent time on deck in the afternoons, watching the sea with the focused attention of a man who has accepted an outcome and is now thinking about what comes after it. He and the captain exchanged more words during this stretch than at any previous point in the voyage, not warmly, still, but with a directness that suggested the Cyprus experience had adjusted their working relationship into something slightly more functional than it had been leaving Tyre. One afternoon, the captain showed the merchant the stars he used for navigation, not a formal lesson, more a sharing of information between two professionals whose domains were adjacent enough that each man's work was affected by the other's knowledge. The merchant knew the stars, the way any educated Phoenician knew them, as cultural and religious objects, as markers of season, as the navigational tools that the sailors around him used, but that he had never needed to use himself. The captain showed him the specific stars he relied on, the relationships between them, the way he cross-referenced multiple positions to arrive at a location on the featureless water that he could express in terms of distance and bearing from the last known point. The merchant listened with the attention of a man filing information that might be useful in contexts he could not yet specify. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both demonstrating that he had understood more than might have been expected from a first exposure. The captain answered both without elaboration. The current in this part of the sea was a factor the captain managed rather than fought. The Mediterranean's surface currents were complex and variable, driven by the interaction of wind, density differences, and the basin's enclosed geography into patterns that changed with the season and with local conditions in ways that resisted simple generalization. What the captain knew was specific to this route, this season, this stretch of water, the product of his own voyages, supplemented by what he had learned from other captains at the ports where such information was traded. The Greek captain in Cyprus had given him updated information about current behavior in the Western Passage that he had incorporated into his calculations, adjusting the course slightly to account for drift that would otherwise have accumulated into a significant positional error over the distances ahead. These adjustments were invisible to anyone not looking for them, small changes in heading that produced their effect over days rather than hours, and that required trust in the calculation behind them rather than the visible feedback that coastal navigation provided. The crew settled into open water life with the adaptation that extended sea time produced. The psychological adjustment to featurelessness, to days and nights in which the visual environment did not change, in which the horizon remained at the same distance in every direction, in which there was no arrival at anything and no departure from anything, only continuous passage through the same substance. This adjustment happened differently for different men. The experienced sailors had made it so many times that it was no longer an adjustment, just a state they inhabited without resistance. For the younger crew members, the featurelessness had to be actively managed, converted from a source of psychological pressure into a neutral condition through the discipline of staying occupied, staying present in the tasks at hand, refusing to project attention toward a destination that was still days away and therefore not usefully contemplated. The young man managed it through observation. There was more to observe on open water than was immediately apparent. The behavior of the sea surface in response to wind changes too subtle to feel directly, the appearance of certain birds that indicated proximity to land masses not yet visible, the occasional presence of floating matter that told a trained eye something about the currents and the geography further ahead. He had learned some of this from the captain's night sessions, more of it from the senior sailor who had moved him to the sail lines, and some of it through his own sustained attention to the water over days of continuous proximity to it. The sea was not featureless if you looked at it correctly. It was densely informative. The information was just encoded differently than it was on land, in a language that required a specific kind of literacy to read. On the 4th day out of Cyprus, the captain altered course slightly to the northwest. The change was small enough that most of the crew would not have registered it consciously, but the young man felt it through the sail lines, a fractional shift in the angle of the wind against the sail, requiring a small adjustment to maintain trim. He made the adjustment and then looked at the captain, who was at the stern, with his gaze on the horizon ahead. The captain did not explain the course change. He did not need to. But later, in the evening, when the young man was near enough to hear without making the proximity conspicuous, the captain said something to the senior sailor about distance and bearing, and a landfall that was now closer than it had been that morning. The young man stored the words and the direction the captain had been looking when he said them, and added them to everything else he was building. That night, the stars were exceptional, the sky fully clear, the sea surface calm enough that the stars reflected in it, the ship moving through a darkness that had light above and below it, and the hull occupying the narrow band between them. The captain worked his position with the particular focused economy of a man who is close enough to his destination that the margin for error has narrowed and the standards have correspondingly risen. The young man watched from his position aft, close enough to observe, far enough to give the captain the space that the work required. At one point, the captain paused in his observation and looked at the young man across the dark deck without speaking. Then he looked back at the stars. The young man looked at the stars too, in the same part of the sky the captain had been reading, and tried to see what the captain saw there. He could not yet. But he was closer than he had been a week ago, and the distance was measurable now, which meant it was closable. The sea ran smooth through the night, and the stars held their positions, and the ship moved west with the steady purposefulness of a vessel that knows, through the knowledge of the men running it, where it is and where it is going. The destination was ahead, not visible yet, but present in the captain's calculations, in the merchant's accounts, in the unnamed items sitting in its wrappings in the hold below, present as a fact that the voyage had been organized around from the beginning and was now close enough to be felt as something other than an abstraction. They were going to arrive. The question that remained, that was always the question that remained until the anchor was down and the lines were fast, was what they were going to arrive into. The first sign was the way he moved. Or rather, the way he stopped moving in the way he normally did, the subtle change in a man's relationship with space and effort that precedes visible illness by hours, sometimes longer, a withdrawal of energy that the body begins before the mind has registered what is happening. The cook noticed it first, because the cook noticed everything that affected consumption. The man had eaten less than usual that morning, and eating less than usual on a voyage where the allowance was already calculated to the minimum functional level was information that meant something. He said nothing immediately. He watched. By midday, it was visible to anyone paying attention. One of the middle-tier sailors, a man in his 30s who had been on the voyage since Tyre without distinguishing himself in any particular direction, competent and unremarkable. The kind of crew member whose presence was registered mainly through what would be missing if he were absent, was sitting against the hull amidships with a posture that communicated something beyond tiredness. Not dramatic suffering. The quieter, more interior suffering of a body that has identified a problem and begun redirecting its resources toward addressing it, leaving the surface functions, movement, engagement, appetite, running on reduced supply. His skin had a quality that the experienced sailors recognized. His eyes, when he opened them, were focused on something closer than the horizon. The captain was informed by the senior sailor, who had been watching the progression since morning. The report was factual and brief. The man's symptoms, their development over the day, the senior sailor's assessment of severity, based on what he had seen before in similar circumstances. Illness at sea was not a rare event in the ancient world. It was a regular operational risk, incorporated into the calculation of crew size the same way weather risk was incorporated into the calculation of route and timing. You expected a certain incidence, you built in enough redundancy to absorb it, and you managed what you could not prevent with the tools available. The tools available were limited. What the ancient world had for treatment was a mixture of practical knowledge, herbal remedies, and interventions, whose efficacy ranged from genuinely useful to neutral to actively harmful, the three categories not always distinguishable from each other with the information available at the time. The cook, whose role expanded in situations like this to include whatever medical function the ship possessed, went to a section of his stores that was separate from the food provisions, small sealed containers of dried plants and prepared substances that he had assembled before the voyage, with the same calculating attention he brought to everything else. He knew what the symptoms suggested. He knew what the available remedies addressed and what they did not. He prepared what he had and administered it without pretending it was more than it was. The sick man was moved below deck, out of the sun and out of the wind, into the relatively stable microenvironment of the hull's interior, where the temperature was more consistent and the motion slightly less amplified than on deck. Someone brought him water. The reduced allowance adjusted upward slightly for the specific requirement of illness, a reallocation that the captain authorized without discussion, because dehydration in a sick man was a complication that could turn a manageable situation into an unmanageable one quickly. The man drank carefully and lay still and submitted to the cook's remedies with the passive cooperation of someone who has run out of alternative approaches. The crew absorbed the reduction in available labor without visible disruption. This was the redundancy built into the crew size, not comfortable redundancy, not a cushion that made the remaining work easy, but functional redundancy, the kind that kept the ship operational at the cost of increased load on the men who remained healthy. Tasks were redistributed without announcement, each person adding to their rotation what the sick man's absence created, the system self-organizing around the gap the way a body reroutes around an injury, not seamlessly, not without cost, but continuously and without requiring the intervention of conscious direction. The ship kept moving. The young man took on part of the sick man's sail work without being asked. He had been watching the redistribution happen around him and had identified the gap before anyone directed him toward it. This was noticed by the senior sailor who had been tracking his development, not commented on, but added to the running assessment that was always in progress, the continuous evaluation of what the young man was becoming relative to what he had been when he boarded in Tyre. The assessment had been moving in a consistent direction. The direction was not surprising, given what had been visible in the first days, but the pace of it was. Below deck, the sick man was worse by evening. The fever that had been building since morning had reached the point where it was producing the specific symptoms that distinguished a serious illness from the minor ailments that resolved themselves: the confusion, the elevated temperature, the difficulty maintaining fluid. The cook adjusted his treatment accordingly, using the more aggressive remedies he had been reserving for this progression, knowing that they carried their own risks, and that applying them required accepting those risks against the greater risk of doing nothing. He had made this calculation before. It was not a comfortable calculation, regardless of how many times you had made it. The rest of the crew handled the situation with the pragmatic restraint that the culture of the ship demanded and that circumstances reinforced. Visible distress about a crewmate's illness was not suppressed out of coldness. It was managed out of the understanding that distress was contagious in the psychological sense, and that a crew already operating with reduced numbers could not afford the secondary effects of collective anxiety on top of the primary effect of the illness itself. This did not mean indifference. It meant a specific form of care that expressed itself through action rather than demonstration. The man who brought the water, the adjustment of the watch rotation to give the sick man's closest crewmate a position that kept him near enough to check without disrupting his function, The cook's sustained and private attention to the treatment through the night. The captain visited the sick man once, briefly, in the early evening. He did not stay long. There was nothing he could do that the cook was not already doing, and his presence below deck for extended periods was a resource the ship needed on deck, where the navigation continued, regardless of what was happening in the hull below it. He looked at the man, asked the cook a direct question, received a direct answer, and returned to the stern. The exchange had lasted less than 2 minutes. In those 2 minutes, the captain had acquired the information he needed and had made the adjustments to his operational planning that the information required. If the man deteriorated significantly, certain options narrowed. If he stabilized, the voyage continued as planned. For now, the cook was managing it, and the cook's judgment in these matters was the resource the ship had. The merchant was aware of the illness and said nothing about it publicly. Privately, in the accounting, he continued to maintain below deck. He had noted it as a variable, not callously but accurately, the way all variables were noted in a system that required complete information to function correctly. A reduced crew affected the efficiency of the remaining passage. Reduced efficiency affected timing. Timing affected the market conditions at the destination. The chain of consequence was real and required tracking. He tracked it. The night was difficult in the way that nights are difficult when something is wrong below the surface of the ship's normal functioning. The watches rotated, the stars were read, the course was maintained, all of it proceeding with the external regularity that the voyage required. But the knowledge of the sick man in the hull below gave the night a quality it had not had before, a weight in the background of the watch that was present, whether acknowledged or not. The young man felt it during his watch in the hours before dawn, standing at his position with the sea dark around him and the stars above, and the sound of the sick man's breathing audible through the deck, planking when the wind dropped momentarily between gusts. He stood still and listened to the breathing and the sea, and did his job. By morning the fever had broken. Not resolved. The man was still weak, still below deck, still removed from the crew's working rotation for at least another day. But the acute phase had passed, the temperature had dropped, the confusion had cleared, and the cook's assessment, delivered to the captain at dawn with the same directness that characterized all communication on this ship, was that the man would recover. The timeline was uncertain. The direction was not. The captain received this information and incorporated it into his planning the same way he incorporated everything, without visible reaction, with complete attention, with the immediate conversion of new information into operational implication. The man would recover. The crew would return to full strength before the destination, or close enough to it that the difference would be manageable. The voyage continued on its track. The destination was closer this morning than it had been the morning before. Whatever was waiting there, the market, the buyer for the unnamed item, the final accounting of everything the voyage had cost and everything it had returned, was now close enough that the captain could feel the approach of it in the changed quality of his own attention. Not anticipation exactly, something more like the recognition that the end of a thing had its own demands, distinct from the demands of the middle, and that those demands were beginning. The sail appeared on the southern horizon in the middle of the second morning after the fever broke. Not close, a small pale rectangle against the deeper blue of the sky, visible only because the day was clear, and because the man on watch had the kind of attention that found things before they declared themselves. He reported it to the stern without drama, the way he had been trained to report things, a fact, a direction, an estimated distance, nothing added that was not observable. The captain looked where the man indicated and stood there for a moment, reading the distant shape with the same systematic attention he brought to everything on the horizon. A sail on the open sea in this period was not a neutral fact. The Mediterranean, in the 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era, was a maritime world that contained, alongside its traders and fishermen and naval vessels, a population of people whose relationship with other ships was defined by opportunity rather than by any governing framework that constrained what that opportunity could mean. Piracy was not a marginal activity. It was a consistent feature of the sea's economy, practiced at varying levels of organization and ambition, from opportunistic attacks on isolated vessels by small local operators, to coordinated raiding by groups with the resources and the planning to target specific routes and specific cargo types. The Phoenicians, whose ships carried high-value goods on known routes at predictable times of year, were not an anonymous target. The captain's first assessment was of the other vessel's heading. A ship maintaining a course that intersected with theirs was a different proposition from one running parallel or diverging. He watched the distant sail for several minutes, tracking its movement against the horizon with the patience of a man who understood that this was a calculation that rewarded time and punished haste. The sail was moving, that much was clear, but the direction required more observation before it could be stated with confidence. He said nothing during this period. The crew, who had been informed of the sighting in the way that information moved on this ship, rapidly, laterally, without announcement, were doing their own watching from their positions, adding their observations to the collective assessment, without converging on the stern and crowding the captain's space. After 10 minutes, the heading was clear enough to work with. The other vessel was running northwest, which put it on a course that would bring it across the Phoenician ship's track at some point ahead, the timing dependent on each vessel's speed and the precise angles involved. Not directly toward them, not directly away, across. Which was the category of heading that required the most careful interpretation, because it contained within it the full range of possible intentions: innocent passage, commercial interest, deliberate positioning for an approach that would only become apparent when it was closer. The captain called the senior sailor to the stern. The conversation was brief and conducted at a volume that carried to the nearest crew members without being directed at them, an act of deliberate transparency, giving the experienced men on deck the information they needed to make their own assessments without creating the impression of a command consultation that excluded the rest of the crew. The other vessel was larger than theirs. That was now determinable from the size of the sail and the hull becoming visible at the base of it as the distance closed. Larger was ambiguous as a fact. Merchant ships ran large, and so did the vessels that preyed on them. The hull shape would tell more, once it was readable. The crew's behavior shifted in a way that was not instructed and did not need to be. Tasks that kept men below deck were deprioritized in favor of tasks that kept them visible on the surface. Items that could serve as weapons if the situation required it were not brandished. That would have been a provocation as well as a premature commitment, but were noted and accessible, the mental inventory of available options updated without being acted upon. The merchant had come on deck when word of the sighting reached him and was standing amidships with an expression that was controlled in the way that genuine concern was controlled by a man who had learned that visible anxiety was a liability in situations where the outcome was not yet determined. He watched the southern horizon with the same fixed attention as everyone else and said nothing. The hull of the other vessel was readable by mid-morning. The captain looked at it for a long time before offering any interpretation, and when he did speak, it was to the senior sailor alone, quietly, in a tone that the crew read correctly as not alarming without needing to hear the words. The hull lines were merchant lines, A round-hulled vessel, deep in the water, the characteristic profile of a ship built for capacity rather than speed. Not conclusive. A vessel could be built for cargo and repurposed for other uses, but significantly better information than the sail alone had provided. The depth of the waterline suggested it was loaded. A loaded ship was not a raiding ship. A raiding ship needed to move fast, and that required a light hull. The identification was confirmed eventually by the flag or signal the other vessel was flying, a Phoenician commercial marker, the specific variant indicating origin from one of the cities further south along the Levantine coast, a vessel from the same broad commercial culture as their own, running the same western routes for the same fundamental purposes. The tension on deck did not dissolve immediately when this became clear. Recognition was not the same as certainty, and certainty in these waters was a standard that required physical proximity to achieve. But it diminished measurably in the quality of attention the crew gave to their tasks, and in the posture of the men who had been watching the southern horizon most intently. The two ships came close enough to exchange signals in the early afternoon, a formalized communication, the maritime equivalent of the brief professional exchange between the captains in Cyprus, conducted at a distance through gestures and markers, whose meaning was understood by anyone operating in the Phoenician commercial network. Destination, approximate position, weather conditions ahead. These were the standard categories, the information that made the brief interruption of two ships' progress worthwhile to both parties. The other vessel was 3 days out of its last port, heading for a destination south of theirs, carrying copper ingots from the Cypriot smelters to a buyer somewhere on the North African coast. Its captain reported no significant weather ahead on his track, which intersected with the Phoenician ship's intended course close enough to the destination that the report was useful. The Phoenician captain conveyed their own position and destination, offered a brief account of the post-storm conditions east of Cyprus, and received an acknowledgement that the information had been received and valued. The exchange lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Then the two ships parted, not with ceremony, with the matter-of-fact resumption of their separate courses that characterized professional encounters in this world, each vessel returning to its own calculation of wind and current, and the distance remaining to wherever it was going. The other ship's sail shrank back toward the southern horizon, and eventually merged with it, becoming a pale mark, and then nothing, the sea returning to its featureless expanse, as if the encounter had not occurred. But it had occurred, and what it had produced, the weather report, the confirmation of position by cross-reference with another navigator's reckoning, the straightforward encounter with another Phoenician vessel in open water without incident, had value that would be felt in the quality of the remaining passage. The young man had watched the entire sequence from his position at the sail lines. He had observed the first sighting, the assessment period, the shift in crew behavior, the gradual resolution of the ambiguity, and the exchange between the ships with the attentiveness of someone who understood that he was watching a complete episode in the management of maritime risk, from detection through assessment, through response, through resolution. He had not been involved in any of the decisions. He had been involved in the execution, maintaining sail trim through the period when the ship's course was being managed, partly in response to the other vessel's movement, keeping the hull at its best speed without being told that speed might matter, reading the situation around him and contributing to it correctly without requiring direction. The senior sailor, at the end of the afternoon, made a comment that was not directed at him, but was positioned to be heard. Something about how a ship handled encounters like this one said more about a crew than any calm day of sailing could. The young man did not respond. He did not need to. The day ended with the other ship gone, and the sea returned to its standard indifference, and the destination now close enough that the captain had begun the specific preparations that preceded a landfall, checking the approach information he carried in memory, reviewing what he knew about the harbor, running through the sequence of decisions that the final day of a voyage required, and that were different in character from the decisions of the open water passage. The coast would appear tomorrow, or the day after. What it would look like from the sea, what the harbor entrance would require, what was waiting on the dock. These were the questions that were now close enough to be concrete rather than hypothetical. The voyage was entering its final register. Everything that had accumulated since Tyre was about to become an outcome. Land appeared on the morning of the 6th day out of Cyprus. Not dramatically, a low darkening of the horizon to the northwest that could have been cloud if you did not know what you were looking for, and that the captain had identified as land 30 minutes before anyone else on deck had separated it from the sky behind it. He said nothing when he first saw it. He watched it for a while, cross-referencing its position against his star readings from the previous 2 nights, against the elapsed time and the estimated speed, against the behavior of the current under the hull over the past day. Then he adjusted the course 2 degrees to the north and still said nothing, which the senior sailors read correctly as confirmation. When the word moved through the crew, it moved quietly, without the release of tension that a landfall after a difficult voyage might have produced in a less experienced group. These were men who had made landfalls before, who understood that the appearance of land on the horizon was not the end of the navigation, but the beginning of its most demanding phase, the approach, where accumulated positional error became immediately consequential, and where the coast's specific hazards replaced the open sea's general ones. The appropriate response to seeing land was not relief. It was increased attention. The sick man had recovered enough to return to limited deck duty 2 days earlier. He moved more carefully than before, his body still in the process of rebuilding what the fever had consumed, but present and functional and aware of the debt his absence had created in the crew's working load. He had not said much since recovering. Not that he was a particularly talkative man before the illness, but the fever had left a quietness in him that was different from his usual reserve, a quality of interiority that the crew gave space to without commenting on. He was at his position on deck when the land appeared. He looked at it for a long time. The coast resolved over the course of the morning from a dark line into something with texture and feature. Hills behind a lower foreshore, the hills brown and rocky in the way that distinguished this part of the western Mediterranean from the greener coasts of the Levantine shore they had left weeks ago. Different vegetation, different rock color, different quality of light. The accumulated differences of geography expressing themselves in the visual character of the land, which was familiar to the captain from previous voyages and entirely new to the young man, who stood at his position and took it in with the particular attention of someone encountering for the first time a place they will carry in memory for the rest of their life. He did not know yet that this was what was happening. That was how those moments always worked. The captain began his approach navigation with the unhurried precision of a man who has done this specific approach before and knows that the unhurriedness is itself part of what makes it safe. He identified the landmarks he was looking for, not all of them visible yet, but the sequence in which they would appear was known to him, and the appearance of each one confirmed the approach track and cleared the next section of the coast for passage. The crew watched this without interfering, keeping the ship at the speed and hitting the captain required, the sail trimmed to maintain progress without outrunning the rate at which the approach could be safely processed. There was no rushing this. There was never any rushing this. The merchant had been awake since before dawn. The cook had noticed the light in his area of the hull during the night watch and had said nothing about it. A man's reasons for sleeplessness before a destination landfall were his own business, and the cook's business was functional rather than emotional, confined to what affected the ship's operation directly. The merchant came on deck at first light and stood amidships and watched the horizon with the focused, forward-oriented attention of a man whose mind was already at the destination while his body was still a day's sailing from it. The transaction that waited there, the final buyer for the remaining cargo, the settlement of the unnamed items transfer, the collection of payments arranged in advance, and the negotiation of those that had not been. This was the calculation that had been running in the background of everything since Tyre. It was about to become foreground. By midday, the harbour entrance was visible, a gap in the coastline that the captain had been navigating towards since the first landmark confirmed the approach track, now close enough that the specific features of the entrance were readable without the kind of interpretation that distant features required. A headland to the north of the entrance, lower ground to the south, the gap between them wider than the entrance to the Cypriot harbour, offering a more forgiving approach, but with its own specific hazards that the captain had catalogued on previous visits and was now running through again from memory as the distance closed. A shoal to the south of the approach track that required a northern bias in the final approach. A current at the entrance that ran differently at different tidal states, and that would need to be accounted for in the timing of the final push through the gap. He was accounting for it. The sail came down in the approach. Not all at once. It was reduced progressively as the harbour came closer. The speed of the vessel managed down to the level that gave the captain control without surrendering the momentum he needed to work against the tidal current in the entrance. The oars came out for the final section. The same sequence as the departure from Tyre, reversed. The human rhythm of rowing, replacing the wind-driven motion for the confined water, where the wind could not be trusted to behave consistently. The crew pulled together with the cadence called from the stern, the hull responding with the slightly different character it had now compared to the beginning of the voyage, lighter in the water with the Cyprus cargo gone. The repaired bow timber visible above the waterline as a slightly different texture of wood against the older hull. The whole vessel marked by what it had been through in ways that were readable to eyes that knew what to look for. The harbour opened around them as they came through the entrance. Different from Tyre, different from Cyprus, a Western Mediterranean harbour with its own organisation and its own character. The layout of the quays, the type of vessels moored along them, the specific population of a port that sat at the far end of the Phoenician trading network, and whose commercial life had been shaped by that position in ways that were visible in the mix of goods and people and languages audible from the water as they came in. Phoenician was spoken here, in the established community that had been present for long enough to put down roots, but it was spoken alongside other languages, in a context that the Eastern Mediterranean ports did not have. The specific multilingualism of a trading settlement far from its origin culture, maintaining its connections through commerce while absorbing the influences of its physical location. The young man heard the Phoenician voices from the dock and looked toward them and found that the sound of his own language, after weeks at sea, had a quality he had not anticipated. The lines went to the dock with the same practice sequence as every previous arrival, the hull settling against the quay with the slight shudder of a vessel that has been moving for a long time and has now stopped, the sudden stillness of the harbour water around them, a contrast to everything the past weeks had been. The captain stepped ashore and stood on the dock and looked back at the ship for a moment, a brief assessment, conducted with the same systematic attention he brought to everything, taking stock of what the voyage had produced and what it had cost in the same glance. The bow repair was visible from the dock. The hull sat correctly in the water. The crew were at their positions. 20 men, all of them present, one of them still recovering, none of them missing. The merchant was already moving up the dock toward the town before the captain had finished his assessment. There was a meeting waiting for him, arranged before the voyage, confirmed through the commercial networks that connected these ports to each other across the distances that ships like this one covered. And the meeting had already been delayed by the storm and the Cyprus negotiation and the sick man's fever and every other thing that had made this voyage take longer than the original schedule had projected. He walked with the directness of a man who has been patient with delays long enough and has now reached the place where patience ends and action begins. He did not look back at the ship. The young man stood on the dock beside the ship and looked at the town above the harbor. Unfamiliar architecture, unfamiliar smells, the specific combination of this port's character settling around him as a sensory fact before it was anything he could process intellectually. He had left Tyre as the newest member of a crew on a voyage he had not fully understood the scale of. He was standing on a dock at the western edge of the known Phoenician world, having come through a storm and a repair and a fever and an uncertain sail on the horizon and the open water passage and everything else the voyage had produced. And he was standing on his own feet, fully functional, having done his work adequately, and in several moments considerably better than adequately. The distance between those two versions of himself was measurable. It had a shape now. The shape was the voyage itself. Behind him, the ship sat at the dock with the patient stillness of a vessel that has arrived. The hold still contained the remaining cargo, the bronze goods, the cedar oil reserved for this port, the unnamed item in its wrappings that had traveled further than almost anything else on board and had arrived intact and undiscussed and waiting for whatever came next. The harbor moved around the ship in its own rhythm, the life of the port continuing as it always continued, indifferent to any individual arrival and entirely dependent on the accumulation of them. Another ship was coming through the entrance behind them. The dock was already reorganizing around the new arrival before the Phoenician vessel had fully settled into its berth. That was how harbors worked. That was how they had always worked. The unloading began the following morning. Not immediately on arrival. The first evening had been consumed by the initial meetings, the verification of the ship's identity and cargo by the port authorities, the preliminary conversations between the merchant and his contacts that established the framework within which the actual transactions would occur. These preliminaries were not formalities in the dismissive sense of the word. They were the infrastructure of trust, the process by which two parties who had done business across a distance confirmed that they were still the parties they had represented themselves to be, that the goods were what had been promised, that the terms agreed before the voyage still reflected the intentions of both sides, now that the voyage had actually happened. Commerce at this distance required this confirmation, because distance itself was a form of risk, a gap across which misunderstanding and changed circumstances could accumulate without either party knowing. The bronze goods came off first. They were the heaviest items remaining in the hold. An unloading sequence followed the same logic as loading sequence. Weight managed deliberately. The hull's trim maintained through the process so that the vessel sat correctly in the water at each stage, rather than developing an imbalance that made the work harder and the ship more vulnerable while it was alongside the dock. The crew handled the unloading themselves, passing items up from the hold through the hatch and along the dock to the storage area, where the merchant's local contacts were receiving and logging each piece against the manifest. The work was physical and repetitive, and required sustained attention to avoid the kind of damage that could occur when heavy objects were moved carelessly in confined spaces. No damage occurred. The merchant conducted the transactions from a position at the edge of the storage area, close enough to monitor the receiving process and far enough from the dockwork to maintain the separation between commercial and operational functions that governed how the voyage was managed. He moved between conversations with different buyers with the controlled efficiency of a man working through a sequence he had planned and was now executing, making the adjustments that the reality of each transaction required while holding the overall shape of the settlement in view. The bronze goods went to a single buyer. The transaction completed with a directness that suggested the price had been largely settled in advance, and the physical inspection was the final step rather than the beginning of a negotiation. The cedar oil went to two buyers, a larger portion to one, a smaller portion to another, who had apparently needed only a specific quantity for a specific application, and had not wanted more than that, regardless of the price. The unnamed item left the ship in the late morning of the first unloading day. The merchant carried it himself, which was the first time since Tyre that he had physically handled it, rather than simply monitored its presence in the hold. He carried it up the dock without assistance, and without drawing attention to what he was carrying in any way that would have distinguished it from any other parcel being moved from a recently arrived ship into the town above the harbour. He was met at the top of the dock by a man the crew had not seen before, not a harbour official, not a trader in the visible sense, a man whose function was not legible from his appearance, and who had clearly been waiting with the patience of someone who had known the arrival was coming and had simply been waiting for it to complete itself. The two men walked into the town together without speaking. That was the last the crew saw of the item or of the man who received it. The captain spent the unloading days managing the ship's transition from a vessel in passage to a vessel in port, a process with its own specific requirements that were distinct from both the voyage management and the commercial operations happening on the dock alongside him. The hull needed inspection, now that it was no longer moving, and could be examined in the stillness of a harbour berth, rather than the continuous motion of the sea. The bow repair was assessed carefully, the captain running his hands over the cured resin, and the backing timber, and the rope binding with the attention of someone determining whether a temporary solution had performed well enough to become a permanent one, or whether the repair needed to be replaced properly before the return voyage. His assessment was that the repair had held correctly, and that the backing timber had distributed the load as intended. He would have it properly replaced here regardless, using the port's shipwright facilities, because adequate for a single passage and adequate for continued use were different standards, and the ship needed to meet the second one. The return voyage had not been discussed with the crew yet. It existed as a known fact. The ship was going back. The route would be the reverse of the outward passage, with variations dictated by season and weather, and what the merchant needed to carry east. But the specifics had not been shared, because the specifics depended on transactions not yet complete and decisions not yet made. The crew understood this without needing it explained. A ship at the end of a voyage was between states, no longer in passage, not yet committed to the next one, existing in the interval where the accounts were settled and the next purpose was assembled. That interval had its own quality, a temporary loosening of the structure that the voyage imposed, a brief period in which the hierarchy relaxed slightly and the men existed as individuals in a port rather than as crew on a ship. The payments were made over 2 days. The merchant received them in the forms that long-distance trade employed in this period: silver by weight, credit arrangements against future transactions, trade goods that represented value rather than conveying it directly, and that would need to be converted on the return passage or back in Tyre into the forms that the investors required. The accounting was complex in ways that the surviving records from comparable periods hint at but do not fully expose. The layering of credit and obligation across multiple transactions, multiple parties, multiple geographies. The whole structure maintained by the reliability of the people involved rather than by any enforcement mechanism that could reach across the distances at stake. It was a system that worked because the people running it needed it to work and had built their commercial lives around making it work and had long memories for the failures that proved the necessity of its maintenance. The crew was paid on the second evening. The amounts varied by role and by the terms. Each man had agreed before the voyage. The senior sailors more, the newer crew less, the gradations reflecting the hierarchy that had governed the passage and that now expressed itself in the distribution of its returns. The payment was made by the captain on behalf of the merchant, a delegation that reflected the operational structure of the voyage rather than any ambiguity about who had funded it. Each man received what he was owed, and the transaction was complete. No ceremony, no acknowledgement of what the voyage had required, just the transfer of value that the agreement had promised and that the work had earned. This was as it should be. The men had not sailed for acknowledgement. The young man received his payment and stood with it for a moment before putting it away. It was less than the senior sailors had received, more than the boy who had spent the voyage in the undefined space between crew and not crew. It was a number that corresponded to a role, the role he had occupied, the function he had performed, the assessment that the people above him in the hierarchy had made of that performance, and had expressed not in words but in this. He put it away without counting it in view of anyone, and returned to the work of preparing the ship for the shipwright's inspection the following morning. The merchant completed his accounting on the second night. The voyage had returned less than the projection he had taken to the investors in Tyre. The cloth price in Cyprus, the offset claim, the delays that had shifted the timing of the final transactions by enough to affect the market conditions he had encountered here. But it had returned enough. The unnamed item had performed as expected, the price for it settling the balance in a way that the visible cargo alone would not have achieved. The investors would receive a return that was below what had been hoped and above what could have been the outcome if the storm had been worse. The fever had not broken. The bow timber had failed in open water rather than in a manageable anchorage. The voyage had been, in the honest accounting of it, fortunate in the ways that mattered most. The captain walked the ship alone in the evening of the second day, after the crew had gone ashore, and the dock had quieted, and the harbour had moved into its nighttime mode of reduced activity and ambient sound. He walked from bow to stern and back, his hands touching the hull at intervals, his attention moving through the vessel the way it always moved, checking, assessing, noting what needed to be done and what had already been done and what the ship was in its current state. The bow repair was there under his hand, the resin hard and the binding tight and the backing timber solid. The hull was sound. The rigging was intact. The hold was empty for the first time since Tyre. The spaces where the cargo had been now just spaces, available for whatever the return passage would require them to hold. He stood at the stern for a while in the dark, with the harbour around him and the town behind him, and the entrance to the harbour visible as a gap in the darkness where the sea was. The return voyage was already assembling itself in his mind, the route considerations, the seasonal weather patterns for the return direction, the ports that would need to be stopped at and the ones that could be bypassed, the crew adjustments that might be required if anyone chose not to make the return. All of it forward-oriented, all of it practical, all of it the continuous process of a man whose work did not have a natural resting point, because the sea did not rest, and the routes did not close, and the demand for what the ships carried did not pause while the people carrying it recovered from having done so. He looked at the harbor entrance for a while longer. Then he went below and slept. The crew dissolved into the port over the following days the way crews always dissolved. Not all at once, not with announcement, but gradually. Each man finding his own relationship with the interval between voyages and occupying it according to his own needs and his own resources. Some went to the Phoenician quarter of the town, where the established community maintained the social infrastructure of a transplanted culture, the specific food, the familiar language, the network of people who shared an origin, and who maintained that shared origin as a resource in a place where it was not the dominant culture. Others dispersed into the wider port town, finding the universal amenities that working harbors provided, regardless of their cultural context. Places to eat, places to drink, places to exist without the constant proximity and mutual obligation of life on a small vessel. The ship sat at the dock empty. This was its least inhabited state. Cargo gone, crew dispersed, the merchant occupied in town with the completion of his transactions and the assembly of what the return voyage would carry east. The hull was present, the mast bare, the sail furled and stowed, the lines holding it to the dock with the same practiced knots that had held it at every dock on the voyage, but now holding nothing in particular, just maintaining the connection between the vessel and the land as a matter of habit rather than necessity. A ship at rest was a different object from a ship in passage. The difference was not in the physical structure. Every timber and rope and fastening was identical in both states. The difference was in what it was for, and in this interval it was not yet for anything. The shipwright had come aboard on the third day and spent several hours with the bow repair, assessing it with the professional attention of someone who had seen improvised storm repairs before and who knew how to read them. What they revealed about the conditions that had necessitated them, about the skill of the people who had made them, about the true state of the timber beneath the visible intervention. His assessment of the temporary repair was positive in the specific, undemonstrative way of professionals evaluating each other's work. The materials had been used correctly. The load distribution was sound. The binding had not loosened under the continued stress of the remaining passage after the storm. He replaced the cracked section anyway, as the captain had requested, using timber from his own stock that matched the original hull wood closely enough in type and age to integrate correctly into the structure. The work took a day. When it was finished, the evidence of the storm damage was gone. The young man stayed near the ship during much of the interval. Not because he had nowhere else to go, the port offered the same range of options as it offered everyone else, but because the ship had become his primary reference point in a way that the port had not yet become, and the pull of the familiar was stronger than the pull of the new, when the new was unfamiliar in every dimension simultaneously. He sat on the dock alongside the hull on some of the afternoons, watching the harbor traffic, noting the different vessel types and where they appeared to be coming from and going to, building the same kind of accumulated observational knowledge that he had been building since the voyage began, the habit of attention persisting even when the specific demands that had formed it were temporarily absent. The captain found him there one afternoon and sat down beside him without preamble and looked at the harbor with him in silence for a while. Then the captain said something about the vessels moored across the harbor, a specific observation about the hull lines of one of them, the way a particular design feature indicated the region where it had been built, the logic connecting the construction choice to the sea conditions that prevailed in that region, and that had shaped the solution the builders had arrived at. The young man listened and looked at the hull the captain was describing, and found that he could see what the captain was pointing to. Not completely, not with the depth of understanding that years of attention would eventually produce, but enough to follow the observation and to ask a question that was specific enough to indicate genuine comprehension rather than polite attention. The captain answered the question. Then he asked one in return. The conversation continued for an hour, moving through subjects that were all in different ways, about how to read the sea and the things on it, conducted between a man who had been doing this for 30 years and a man who had been doing it for the duration of a single voyage. The distance between those two positions was enormous. The conversation happened anyway, because the distance was not the point. The direction was the point. The young man was moving in the right direction, and the captain had recognized this, not recently. He had recognized it on the first morning in Tyre, when the young man had stayed at his rope problem without complaint, and without the kind of visible self-consciousness that indicated a person who was performing competence rather than developing it. The conversation on the dock was a form of investment, made by a man who understood that the network of competent sailors the Phoenician trading world depended on was maintained not by the sea itself, but by the specific decisions of specific people to transmit what they knew to people who were capable of receiving it. The merchant completed his transactions by the end of the first week in port. The return cargo had been identified and partially assembled. Goods from this end of the Mediterranean that had value in the East, items whose precise nature the records of comparable voyages hint at without specifying, raw materials not available in the Levant, finished goods that represented Western craft traditions, trade items whose value was partly intrinsic and partly in the fact of their having come from far away, which was itself a form of value in a world where distance was difficult and therefore significant. The loading would begin when the cargo was fully assembled. The departure would follow the loading by a day or two, depending on conditions. The return voyage was becoming real in the way that departures became real, through the accumulation of concrete preparations that converted an intention into a fact. The crew reassembled around the ship as the departure approached, drawn back by the same gravity that had dispersed them, the knowledge of what was coming next, the habits of role and function that the voyage had established, and that the port interval had suspended but not erased. They came back changed in small ways, rested, fed differently than the ship's provisions had allowed, with the minor psychological reset that time on solid ground in a functioning town provided after weeks at sea. The sick man came back looking better than he had looked since before the fever. The recovery complete, now in a way that the final days of the outward passage had only suggested was coming. He took his position on the ship with the quiet purposefulness of a man who has been away from his function and is returning to it without drama. On the last evening before departure, after the return cargo had been loaded and the provisions restocked, and the water jars filled and the sail inspected and the repaired bow examined one final time by the captain, the ship sat at the dock in a state that was the inverse of the empty state it had occupied for the past 10 days. Full again, different cargo, same weight, the whole sitting at the same depth in the harbour water that it had sat at when it arrived from Tyre weeks earlier. Ready, in the functional sense, everything that the voyage required in place, everything that could be addressed having been addressed, the remaining uncertainty belonging to the category of things that preparation could not eliminate, only accommodate. The young man sat at the bow in the evening, in the position where he had spent so many hours of the outward voyage, watching the harbour entrance where the open sea was visible as a darkening beyond the headlands. The return voyage would take him back along a route he now knew, not completely, not with the depth of knowledge that the captain carried, but with the specific familiarity of someone who had travelled it once in one direction and would now travel it in the other, seeing from the opposite side the features that had been landmarks from the first approach, re-encountering the water that had been the storm and the bay, and the open passage in a different season and a different configuration. Nothing would be the same. Everything would be recognizable. That was what knowledge of a route felt like from the inside. Not certainty, but the particular form of competence that came from having survived the uncertainty once and being willing to engage it again with better information than you had before. The harbor around the ship moved through its evening routines. Lamps came on in the buildings above the quay. A vessel that had been anchored in the harbor roads during the day came into the dock, and its crew began the familiar sequence of arrival. Lines, sail, the voices calling across the water in the compressed language of people completing a passage and beginning the stationary part of what came after it. The Phoenician ship sat in its berth, and was not part of this, and was adjacent to all of it, occupying the threshold between the harbor's daily life and the sea beyond it. By morning, it would be on the other side of that threshold. Tonight it was still here, in the port, in the last hours of the interval. The captain was below, asleep or close to it, the monitoring part of his consciousness already reorienting toward the sea that was coming, rather than the harbor that was present. The merchant was in town, completing the final formalities of the transactions, ensuring the documentation that would be required back in Tyre was in order, maintaining the paper record of the voyage's commercial outcomes that would survive it in ways that the voyage itself would not. Most of the crew were asleep or in the final stages of the evening that preceded sleep, the rhythms of shipboard life reasserting themselves with the quiet authority of patterns that the body had spent weeks encoding and had not had long enough ashore to forget. The ship was ready. That was the accurate statement of its condition in that last evening in the western port, in the harbor at the far edge of the Phoenician trading world, under a sky that was the same sky that had been above it in Tyre and above it in Cyprus and above the storm and the open passage and all the water between those points. Ready for the return, carrying what it carried, crewed by the men who had come this far and would now go back, marked by what the voyage had required of it, the repaired bow, the replaced section of timber that carried no visible evidence of what it had replaced, the hull itself seasoned by the specific passage it had made and ready for the next one. This was what ships were. This was what they did. Not once. Continuously. Until they did not. The young man stayed at the bow until the harbor had gone fully dark, and the stars had appeared above the entrance, and the sound of the port had settled into its nighttime register. Present but reduced, the active day compressed into the ambient hum of a place that never fully stopped, but slept in its own fashion. He looked at the stars for a while, the specific stars the captain had shown him on the open water, the ones that held position and gave direction, the ones that had been above every point of the voyage from departure to here. He could find them now without looking for them. That was the difference. A month ago he would have searched. Now they were simply there, in the part of the sky where they always were, available without effort, part of the map he was building that had no physical form but that was becoming, passage by passage, real. He looked at the harbor entrance one more time, the gap in the darkness, the sea beyond it catching the starlight in the way that open water caught starlight, the faint luminescence of a surface that extended further than vision could follow in any direction. Tomorrow it would carry them again. The same sea that had been under them since Tyre, that had held the storm and the bay and the open crossing and the approach to this port, and that would hold the return with equal indifference and equal capability to end the voyage before it ended on its own terms. He had learned things about it on the outward passage that the return would test. He expected to learn more. That expectation was itself something new, not the anxiety of a first voyage, not the false confidence of someone who has survived one passage and concluded they have understood the thing that produced it. Something more accurate than either. The sea was large and specific, and required continuous attention, and rewarded it with the particular form of knowledge that could not be acquired any other way. He understood that now. He went below and lay down in his place among the cargo and the sleeping men, and listened to the ship in the harbor, the different sounds of a vessel at rest, the ropes against the dock, the water against the hull without the motion of passage behind it, the small creaks of timber settling into stillness. Around him, the crew breathed in the dark. 20 men who had come from Tyre and were going back, who had done what the voyage required and were ready to do what the return would require, carrying in their bodies and their minds the accumulated information of everything that had happened between the departure and this night. None of it written down, all of it present. The harbor held the ship through the night. The stars moved in their slow arc above the entrance. The sea waited beyond the headlands with the patience of something that has been waiting since before any of this existed, and will be waiting long after the last trace of it is gone. The ship was a small thing against that scale. It had always been a small thing against that scale. The people on it had always known this and had gone anyway, voyage after voyage, generation after generation, carrying what the world needed, moved across the water that divided the places that had it from the places that needed it. Not because the sea was kind, not because the outcome was certain, because the alternative was to stay on the shore and watch the water, and know that what was needed was on the other side of it, and that the only way to the other side was through.